nor did it fully consider the social and cultural benefits that come from being an open, connected European nation. And therefore, this government will consider whether to commission further research and independent expert advice where necessary to ensure that Scotland's needs are taken into account.
Gordon MacDonald.
Do the recommendations made in this report not completely misunderstand much of the Scottish context of this? For example, that Scotland's demographic issues, our ageing population of working age, can be solved by raising the age of retirement. Surely there are simpler, more effective ways than that to tackle a shortfall of workers in our public services. For example, by attracting more migrants of working age to live here.
Minister.
Absolutely. I think Gordon MacDonald raised these very important points there around demographics that were not considered appropriately or fully in the MAC report. All of our population increase here in Scotland over the next 25 years is due to come from migration, according to official statistics. However, the Migration Advisory Committee's report this morning does little to consider Scotland's needs and instead suggests that increasing the pension age, quite remarkably, would be a preferential approach to managing demographic change, a completely unsustainable position and one which many across Scotland would reject, and we in the Scottish Government do too. As we saw yesterday from the British Futures report based on ICM polling, there is clear public support for an approach here in Scotland which would give more powers to the Scottish Government, accountable to this Parliament, to develop a tailored approach to migration which meets the needs, Scotland's distinct needs, and an approach which would be endorsed by this Parliament.
Gordon MacDonald.
The report does acknowledge that the devolution of immigration power is ultimately a political choice. The Scottish Government's outward-looking, welcoming, positive approach to immigration couldn't be further removed from the right-wing rhetoric emanating from the UK Government in the Brexit context. Indeed, yesterday's poll in the Herald showed that 2/3 of Scots want immigration powers devolved. Isn't it high time Westminster listened to those demands?
Minister.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to reiterate that this report does acknowledge at 7.72 that the devolution of immigration powers is ultimately a political choice. The Scottish Government's outward-looking, welcoming, positive approach to immigration couldn't be further removed from the right-wing rhetoric emanating from the UK Government. Gordon MacDonald is absolutely right to say that. The report a year ago from the Migration Observatory that they published specifically considered a regional migration system. They concluded that the arguments against a regional visa system were not about practicalities, but about politics. And as has been mentioned already today, the report from the British Futures published yesterday provided some very clear messages. Firstly, people do not trust the UK Government to manage immigration. That was made abundantly clear in the report, with only 15% of people surveyed by ICM thinking that the UK Government had managed immigration into the UK competently or fairly. And indeed, to quote the British Futures report, the current immigration system does not command public trust and support. Secondly, and also very importantly to us here in this Parliament, people were also clear when polled by ICM about the sort of change they want to see. 64% of people in Scotland agree that the governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland should have the power to decide how many visas are issued to people who want to work in those parts of the UK, and they agreed to this proposal. There is a clear and building and growing consensus that in order to meet the economic and demographic needs of Scotland, we need more powers to this Parliament in order to create tailored solutions. It's time for the UK Government to listen to the calls from business, civic society, universities, across civic society, and also listen to the people of Scotland who, by 2/3, believe that more powers should come to this Parliament in order to manage our migration system in a more humane and forward-looking manner.
Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Minister agree that we should end the discrimination against EU workers referred to in the report? But the report said they were not convinced that the route for low-skilled workers was one that should be created, and the Minister will be aware of the two-tier visa currency that applies to a list of occupations where there is a shortage, such as cybersecurity, paediatrics, game designs and so on. So I do agree that Scotland should have a say in the immigration policy that should be fit for the whole of UK, and I've argued this consistently. But I would like to know, what list of occupations have the Scottish Government put forward for that two-tier visa, and what precise dialogue have ministers had to make the case for Scotland's interest to be addressed in that list of occupations, because surely there must be a case put for low-skilled workers to be on that list.
Minister.
Thank you, Pauline McNeill, for that important question. I think the interesting balance that there is between high-skilled and low-skilled workers, and the way that the report preferences some above the others, is disappointing, and will be disappointing to industries across Scotland like tourism, hospitality, the agricultural sector and social care that rely on low-skilled workers. And I think while we would welcome the fact that the report states argues for a lifting of the cap for Tier 2, that will not be a substantial enough change in order to bring the amount of workers that we need to the Scottish economy to fulfil the demands that there are in the public and private sectors. With regard to the occupation list, now, there is reference to this at 7.73 of the report, where there is an acknowledgement that there is a difference between what the short occupation list could be in Scotland or other devolved areas compared with the UK. This is a matter I have pressed the UK Government on as Minister. I met with Caroline Noakes, the Immigration Minister, in the summer, and pressed her on this point. And she gave me an undertaking that the UK Government would look at how there could be Scottish Government input and potentially wider from Scottish civic society and business into that occupation list in order to make sure it was fit for purpose. I am pursuing a follow-up meeting with the Minister in order to continue to press this point, and will also be meeting the chairman of the MAC report, and will be taking this matter up with him in due course.
And Neil Findlay.
I have to say to you, Minister, social care workers are not low-skilled in my opinion, but can I say that social attitudes in Scotland on immigration are very much very similar to those across the rest of the UK. But does he agree that putting limits on the number of people migrating to the UK is arbitrary? And what we need is a fair and humane and non-discriminatory policy that meets the needs of the nations and regions of the UK in an inclusive way.
Minister.
Again, I thank Neil Findlay for that important question, and share much of the sentiment in it. First of all, I absolutely value all skills in our economy. The point I was making is that one of the problems with the MAC is that it gives a hierarchy towards some skills more than the other, and deeply value the commitment of social care workers throughout Scotland and in my constituency, and that is the view of other government ministers. It's a highly regarded sector, and we want those who are working in our social care sector to stay and continue to contribute and take care of the people that we know, our neighbours and friends, and those in our communities. In terms of the wider point, which Neil Findlay was absolutely right to bring up around the UK Government's arbitrary, insensitive, unhelpful, inflexible, unworkable commitment to bring migration down to the tens of thousands, he's absolutely right to point out the wrong-headedness of this approach, both logically and in principle. And I think the fact that the report has asked for a lifting of the cap for Tier 2 suggests that there should be a shift in thinking on this point across the board. And I would share the sentiment that he put forward in his question on that point.
Question number 2, Jamie Green.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to reports that £45 million has been loaned to Ferguson Marine, and whether this is related to the provision of 2 new ferries being built under contract to CMAL.
Cabinet Secretary Derek Mackay.
Scottish shipbuilding has a proud history and a bright future. That's why this government will continue to support the industry to thrive and reach its full potential. I advised the Finance and Constitution Committee earlier this year that ministers had approved commercial loan facilities of up to £45 million for Ferguson Marine. The loan facilities were reported to Audit Scotland, and the expenditure will be recorded in the Scottish Government's consolidated accounts. The delayed delivery of the 2 new CalMac vessels is disappointing, but the commercial loan facilities provided to Ferguson's will support delivery of these vessels and help the business to diversify.
Jamie Green.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. Unfortunately, it took a number of FOIs and press reports for the Government to come to the Chamber and tell Parliament more information about these loans. Can I read the opening line of the FOI response? It says, the Scottish Government does not hold detailed information on all public funding provided to private companies in Scotland. I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, I find that absolutely incredulous. Why does it not hold those details? So let me ask some specific questions to allow the Cabinet Secretary to clarify this money. First of all, the £15 million loan. What was its purpose? What due diligence was done on the firm before the loan was made? And what analysis has been done on how that money has been spent? Secondly, the additional £30 million loan facility was explicitly not to go towards the CMAL ferries or pay for budget overruns in those contracts, but instead it was designed to win new business opportunities, in contrast to what the Cabinet Secretary has just said. So can the Minister clarify, for the record, that none of the money that has currently been loaned to Ferguson has not and will not be used on the existing troubled ferry contracts?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that's quite an incredible position for the Conservatives to hold. They clearly don't speak to each other. It's just not true to say that I haven't informed Parliament of these loans, when in fact, as I referenced in my initial answer, I have informed Parliament, particularly the Finance and Constitution Committee. I did so on April the 24th and on June the 27th. Now, I'm under no obligation to present the information to Parliament that I did. I went beyond the expectation, in the spirit of transparency, to offer that information to the Finance Committee, and I think that's the appropriate thing to do. Now, I have to say that most members of Parliament understand issues of commercial confidentiality. Certainly members of the Finance Committee, including the responsible Conservative members of the Finance Committee, understand what commercial confidentiality is, and there are some matters that do stay private. Of course, we have fulfilled our obligations under freedom of information. Again, in terms of support for Ferguson's, and I do think it's incredible from a member that seeks to be elected in the west of Scotland trying to undermine Ferguson's in the fashion that he is. But the financial support for Ferguson's is to ensure, of course, the delivery of the viability, the ongoing continuation of work for the yard, to ensure that they had working capital. That was the specifics around the request. And of course, we want the delivery of the new vessels as well. So I think it's good for a government to engage, to ensure that we can support Scottish shipbuilding in the fashion that we have. And I say again, Presiding Officer, without any obligation to do so, I wrote and informed the Finance Committee of the loans that the Scottish Government was providing.
Jamie Green.
Presiding Officer, this isn't about whether the Government should or should not support the marine industry. This is about accountability, transparency from this Government and good governance, none of which I've heard today from the Cabinet Secretary. This project is already a year delayed by at least a year and already tens of millions of pounds over budget. There's also talk of a dispute between the yard owners, the Government and CMAL over project management and where the liability of these financial overruns lie. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell us in very simple terms, delays cost money. Who will pick up the tab for this dispute? Is it Ferguson Marine or the Scottish taxpayer?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, let me be very clear on ferries investment. This Government's invested over £1 billion in terms of ferry services since 2007. We've deployed new ferries for the network, and that's been an enhancement of the CalMac fleet. Now, does the Conservatives not even welcome the fact that we are trying to support Scottish shipbuilding? What is so wrong with that position, that the Scottish Government is trying to support Scottish shipbuilding? 400 jobs at Ferguson's. Is that not to be welcomed by the Conservatives and others in the Chamber, including new apprentices as well. Now, of course, the delays are not welcome. They are unfortunate, but it's still this government that's committed to that investment for those new vessels. And I can say again that Jamie Green may not be familiar with issues of commercial confidentiality, but of course due diligence has been conducted. This was a question that was posed to me by the member that now seems more interested in other matters. Of course due diligence was undertaken in relation to these commercial loans. These are commercial loans with commercial terms and bound by commercial confidentiality. Is the member seriously suggesting we now shouldn't respect that and not respect the fact that the government's interventions ensured not only have we helped save the yard, but we are delivering 400 jobs in that part of Scotland? The vessels will absolutely be delivered, and the working capital issue that was raised by Ferguson's, we have provided support through these loans. I say again, the more responsible members of the Conservative Party who are on the Finance Committee were alerted to the loans over and above the expectations of transparency of me as a Cabinet Secretary. In fact, it was to be fully transparent that I offered that information in terms of the loans to the committee, who respected that. And finally, I am aware that a committee that Jamie Green is a member of was invited out to the yard to find out more about the vessels, and I don't think he has yet visited the yard, despite that offer having been made. So this government will do the right thing by Scottish industry and Scottish jobs. And if that means that a Scottish shipbuilder is building vessels for our CalMac fleet, then surely that should be welcomed.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that it's the height of utter hypocrisy of a Conservative MSP, particularly one with a Port Glasgow connection, to come to this chamber, bearing in mind the absolute devastation his party did to shipbuilding in 1979 when they shut the yards, paid off thousands and devastated communities, including our own?
Cabinet Secretary.
I do agree with Stuart McMillan in that regard. I think that it's been important that the Scottish Government, not just for shipbuilding, but in industrial interventions across Scotland, this Government has taken bold decisions to support Scottish industry. And I think this is a good example of that. The Tories, not satisfied in devastating Scottish industry, even now in opposition, are undermining and attacking our efforts to support the Scottish economy. And yes, it is surprising. It is surprising when it comes from a member who proclaims to be for jobs in the west of Scotland and Inverclyde to try and undermine those efforts from the Scottish Government here in the chamber today.
Colin Smith.
Officer, the Cabinet Secretary will be aware that the costs for the completion of the two ferries being built by Ferguson's to serve the Clyde and Hebrides network are rising, and the company have claimed this is due to insufficient design work by Seamile prior to them issuing the invitation to tender. Ferguson's have described discussions with Seamile as frustrating. So does the Cabinet Secretary therefore not agree that it's time to get Seamile, the Government and Ferguson's round the table to resolve these issues and get these ferries completed as soon as possible at a fair price that delivers for increasingly frustrated passengers but helps secure the future of this important shipyard and their workforce?
Cabinet Secretary.
I actually thank the member for the way in which she's raised that particular issue. I think that's a far more helpful contribution than simply the Tories trying to undermine the loan support that we've given to the company. I am clearly, as Finance Secretary, interested in procurement right across the public sector, and I think there is something to be said for ensuring that all parties here do continue to talk, to get round the table, to ensure that we can make the necessary progress. But in essence, this question was about the commercial loan that's been offered, and I think I've been able to show that I've absolutely complied with the expectation of Parliament, gone above and beyond in terms of offering that information to the Finance Committee. As to further work in relation to Seamile, who of course are the procuring authority here, and FML, then yes, I think we can have further discussion in that regard.
Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the REC Committee, I've heard how important new ferries are for Scotland. We've heard that we need a new one to be ordered every year for the next 10 years. So I don't dispute that. What I'm asking the Cabinet Secretary is does he think that due diligence has been correctly done in this case when the company that the loan has been made to haven't submitted audited accounts since 2015, which actually raises the question of whether it is diligent to lend them that money. Just asking the question, where's your due diligence, Cabinet Secretary?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, any offer of a loan, of course, we would expect due diligence to be complied with. It has been. There has been external consultants working in that regard, as well as finance officials as well. Again, members would expect me to appreciate and abide with commercial confidentiality, but I can certainly give the reassurance to the Chamber that due diligence was carried out. This is a commercial loan with commercial terms. Clearly the benefits to Scotland and Scottish shipbuilding are clear. But yes, I am surprised that now the Conservatives are turning on the company involved in the fashion that they are. I think maybe Edward Mountain might want to engage with. Oh, the Tories seem quite agitated this afternoon. It's your question, I have to say. The Conservatives might want to talk to your colleagues, who of course are represented on the Finance Committee, in terms of the information that was raised. I've pointed out to Mr Green, I'm sure Edward Mountain, if you're a member of the same committee, I think you are, would have been given the invitation to visit the yard as well. And I've been quite happy to engage in questions that have been asked, or any FOI. Further to that, if the Finance Committee wants further information, of course I'll engage positively with them. I'll remind the Chamber once again, without any obligation to do so, I volunteered the issue of the loan to the committee, and I think that that was a responsible thing to do. And rather than dragged to the Chamber, I've been quite forthcoming in the information that I've presented. And of course, we'll add the further information that I referred to in my opening answer.
I think we've got just enough time this afternoon. Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I wonder whether I could invite the Cabinet Secretary to continue to be forthcoming, and does he not consider that actually the problem here is CMAL and not Ferguson's, and when is he going to sort that out?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm sure that Jackie Bailey well understands that in relation to any procurement issue or dispute, it wouldn't be appropriate for me in the Chamber to take sides in that regard. But I think I've referred to her colleague earlier on, and to say that if there's anything further I can do in terms of procurement responsibility, of course I'll engage in that. And I'll be genuinely happy to engage with Jackie Bailey on this and any other matter.
Thank you very much to the member and to ministers. That concludes topical questions. We'll turn now to our next item of business, which is a debate on motion 13912 in the name of Gordon Lyndhurst on bank closures, impact on local businesses, consumers and the Scottish economy. And I would encourage members who wish to speak in this afternoon's debate to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call on Gordon Lyndhurst to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the Economy Committee. Thank you.
Jesus cast the money changers out of the temple. And from 1500, that is the year 1500 onwards in continental Europe, 5% was generally considered to be the highest acceptable rate of interest. Everything above that was usury. At least that was until the lenders of Geneva threatened to leave along with their capital. And when that happened, 6.6% became permissible. Sound familiar? Dante wrote the money lenders into his seventh circle of hell. Presiding Officer, you'd think by now that bankers might have reviewed their PR strategy. I'm afraid our inquiry found little to help repair the reputation. The rate and scale of bank closures has impacted on people, businesses and economy. The number of banking premises in Scotland has fallen by a third since 2010. The Big Five, between them, have closed 479 branches. The Royal Bank of Scotland topping that table with 235 closures. UK figures show branches closing at a rate of 60 a month since 2015, and Edinburgh is the worst hit local authority area in the whole of the UK, having lost 50 branches. Mark Twain may or may not have said, "A banker is a man who lends you an umbrella when the weather is fair and takes it away from you when it is raining." But it seems an awful lot of umbrellas are being taken away from us. Reuters' analysis of official UK figures showed 90% of the 600 closures in 2015 to 16, and I quote, were in areas where the median household income is below the British average of £27,600. In other words, predominantly in poorer areas. Scotland's Towns Partnership told the committee, and again I quote, whenever they decant, that quickly leaves a sense of decline and despair, a toxic legacy. And you don't have to venture far to find an empty former bank building. Number 30 London Road, which is a 3-minute walk from here, was a branch of Lloyds TSB until 2011. Since when it's lain empty. Little more than a canvas for graffiti and stark visual reminder of a vanished bank. FSB Scotland told us there are 258 more empty units now than 2 years ago, a blight on many a high street. Our inquiry found no evidence of the banks proactively engaging with communities on what to do with these buildings. Could this be an opportunity to provide for local needs, to bring the generations together, to create co-working spaces, to cater for startups and social enterprises? We want the Scottish Government, councils and the banks to work together to find solutions. But it's not only bricks and mortar being abandoned. Which estimated there are 130 cash deserts in Scotland, areas with no access to a bank or ATM for miles. There are communities feeling forgotten, left behind, written off. The Scottish Grocers Federation criticised what they see as London-centric decision-making. Pete Kema said, I wonder sometimes whether the banks understand Scotland's landscape. The banks themselves told us they don't coordinate their closures to ensure adequate provision in communities. And some of our witnesses promoted the idea of working together to provide a banking hub. Others proposed alternative formats, more flexibility, diversification. Now, a number of the banks seemed sympathetic to these suggestions. Curry Community Council encouraged the banks to show a bit of imagination and make branches more multi-purpose. Creative solutions have occasionally been found elsewhere. Newcastle Building Society opened a branch in a library that would otherwise have closed. Some witnesses argued that banks should be subsidised to keep unprofitable rural branches going. Another proposed the model of Germany's community banks, the Sparkasse, as an option. So there are many ideas, but the scale and speed of the closures demands urgencies. We therefore invite the Scottish Government to call a summit with the high street banks to consider all possible solutions, including shared banking hubs, and indeed to report back to us with their outcomes. We accept that customer behaviour is changing. The committee, of course, recognises this. 71% of the population now bank online. 22 million of us now use mobile banking apps. 7 out of 10 people see the bank as something to carry around in their pocket. And according to UK Finance, debit card payments overtook cash for the first time in 2017. Is cash really still king? Well, compare London with rural Scotland. The difference is striking. In the former, that is London, cash makes up 55% of retail sales. In the latter, that is rural Scotland, the figure edges 80%. FSB Scotland contrasted claims of a soon-to-be cashless society with what their membership told them, namely that cash was absolutely central to how they operate. Barry McCulloch said, and I quote, "We honestly find it difficult to digest the bank's perspective." So there are plenty of people and places still dependent on cash and who either can't or won't join the digital revolution. Citizens Advice Scotland estimated 20% of consumers are not online. This is particularly the case in rural areas with poor broadband and mobile, and that is poor mobile coverage. Older customers, disabled people, the vulnerable, and those living in our more deprived areas. A postmaster told us, waking up in the morning with a sense of purpose, something to do, a place to go, is really important for many elderly and lonely citizens. And Age Scotland, Scottish Rural Action and Unite all made similar points. Disability Equality Scotland were critical of mobile banking vans. In a survey of their members, 81% felt these banks on wheels were not a suitable alternative to the high street branch. So it is crucial that these communities continue to have access to bank accounts and financial services, including cash. Yes, certainly.
Sandra White.
Thank you very much, Mr Linters. It was just on the issue of people having access. You mentioned post offices. Certainly in very many areas, the post offices, unfortunately, or fortunately, become the local bank and socially for vulnerable people. Will you include looking at post offices when you ask the Scottish Government to have an inquiry into that? Because it seems that the post offices, while they're providing this service, are not getting the same remuneration as a bank would.
Gordon Lindhurst.
Yes, well, thank you for that intervention. The post offices and these issues that you raise were in fact looked at by the committee and covered in the inquiry report. And certainly that is an issue and a live one in terms of banking service provision once banks leave an area. So certainly that was covered. And the committee believes that there must be universal banking provision where there is the need or desire. We recommend then that the UK Government's newly established Financial Inclusion Policy Forum address these issues, that they consider how people can continue to access cash and other banking services in the wake of all the closures in Scotland. The impact of closures looks certain to be compounded by reduced access to free ATMs. Somewhere between 300 and 700 could close in Scotland. FSB Scotland pointed us to research showing that a third of high street spend depends on the availability of an ATM. They are a lifeline to many communities. We recommend to the UK Government that ATM provision be given independent oversight. Presiding Officer, Adam Smith is meant to have said, all money is a matter of belief. The veracity of that quote is questionable unless you count a fridge magnet reliable. But the banks have certainly tested our belief in how seriously they take customer views. They told us it is our behaviour and demand driving branch closures. It's apparent, however, that the banks themselves are pushing the pace of change. And we question how they can know what the customers want without consulting them. In our own survey, 90% of business respondents said closures have or will have an impact on productivity. Personal banking may be in decline, but the commercial side appears to be less so. The Scottish Grocers Federation said, and I quote, "Banks have not done full analyses, which is where they have failed." And the FSB Scotland reported low awareness and confidence in the access to banking standard. They called it a paper tiger. Citizens Advice Scotland said it failed to find out about the effect on local people. Others called it a shamble, a charade, a tick box exercise. We found the standard was failing to ensure the consideration of all relevant impacts on the local economy, that it reflected the interests of the banks, not customers and businesses. Banks should be required to consult with customers, businesses and the community before deciding to close a branch, and the standard ought to be replaced by a statutory model including a stipulation to consult. We invite the UK Government to consider these findings, bearing in mind that banking and financial services are reserved. Our inquiry took evidence from banks, businesses, community groups, equality bodies, unions, the Post Office, Which and Link. We organised focus groups with the good people of Mintlaw, Dalmellington and Leven. We issued a call for views and a survey to which more than 700 individuals and businesses responded. We cannot claim, though, to have formed a full picture of the overall impact of bank closures. A systematic study, not only in Scotland but across the UK, would be most timely. A response from the UK Treasury, along with letters from the Scottish Government, the banks and others, arrived yesterday. The tone and tenor are not terribly surprising. There's a good deal of agreement with much of what we found, but something of an absence to solid commitments. I leave my colleagues, should they wish, to pick up the details or other aspects of the report and the evidence that we considered as a committee. Bill Gates said, "Your most unhappy customers are your greatest source of learning." On that basis, Presiding Officer, the wisdom of the banks must be beyond doubt. I move the motion.
Thank you. I now call on Kate Forbes to open for the Government, to be followed by Dean Lockhart. Kate Forbes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Gordon Lyndhurst for raising today's motion on behalf of the Economy, Jobs and Fair Works Committee. And it's to the credit of the committee that this report can now be quoted alongside Mark Twain, Dante and Jesus. And I think it has been an impressive piece of work to highlight the issue of bank branch closures and to provide a platform for consumers, businesses and communities to express their concerns and fears. The lengthy list of written evidence, those who gave written evidence and verbal evidence, I think demonstrates the strength of feeling and the scale of feeling right across sectors in Scotland. Communities are now feeling the effects of the closures announced at the end of last year, leaving many areas with significantly reduced branch coverage. And it provides another evidence base, along with reports done by Highlands and Islands Enterprise, to back up that anecdotal strength of feeling. The RBS closures that prompted the committee's interest were the latest in a series of closures. And this is an issue that affects, of course, all banks, and therefore finding solutions, and as Gordon Lyndhurst talked about, concrete, tangible actions to respond to that feeling must be the responsibility of all banks. It's not just about resolving the challenges that we currently face and that communities are facing across Scotland, but in light of additional announcements that have been made since December's announcement, albeit not in Scotland, it's likely that this continues to be a challenge that banks must resolve. The worst impact is, of course, felt by rural communities, small businesses and by the most vulnerable in society, for many of whom going into a branch remains the only feasible way to conduct their banking. And the key message for me in all of this is, whilst banking needs are changing and there are new ways to bank, customers still require choice. And those who don't want or can't manage that digital options should not be left behind. Digital progress is a great opportunity to be more inclusive, and yet with some of these closures, digital progress has been seen as exclusive, and that is not right. As the committee makes clear, the UK Government retains legislative and regulatory responsibility for banking, and I've noted the calls by the committee to the UK Government to act and respond in different ways. The Scottish Government has said from the outset that it remains ready to work with UK ministers, with banks and with other stakeholders to support customers and communities in light of these closures. And my predecessor, Paul Wheelhouse, raised the issue of closures with the Economic Secretary to the Treasury within days of the announcement, pressing the case for access to essential banking services to be maintained. And we have publicly and clearly called on banks to consider the needs of Scotland's communities, and especially the needs of the most vulnerable members of those communities, who still need choice. I appreciate that the banks must operate on a commercial basis and that they will take decisions on the provision of services to customers in that context. However, the banking system must meet the needs of all users. It cannot leave users behind. It has a duty of care to all users, and while some will want and choose to use digital options, there are many who cannot, and they cannot be left behind. The committee has asked the UK Government to consider whether an independent impact assessment, including the impact on local economies, should be carried out before a decision is made. And that's often been an issue that's been raised with me, both as a constituency MSP and as a minister, that individuals who use banks don't feel like there was sufficient consultation or sufficient information or sufficient opportunity to shape the decisions that banks took. The committee asked the UK Government to replace the access to banking standard with a statutory model, and I and the Scottish Government agree with the committee's call for a review of the access to banking standard, because there needs to be a channel by which customers can shape and influence banks' decisions on the local provision of services. I will.
John Mason.
I thank the Minister very much for giving way. I mean, the banks have been arguing that they cannot do consultation before they close, which I struggle to understand, because before schools close or anything else, there's consultation. Is she convinced by the bank's argument that they couldn't do consultation?
Minister.
I think there is definitely scope for banks to engage more in advance of a decision that's made, rather than just informing those who use the bank after it has been made. The standard that has been referenced is incorrectly perceived by many to be a model of consultation with communities and bank branch closures, but it's just a set of guidelines at the moment on what information will be presented to customers in the event of a closure decision. And there currently remains no channel by which customers can influence the bank's decisions. And in my conversations with those who depend on face-to-face access, they're not demanding that there is no change or no progress. What they are saying is that their needs need to be recognised. And I fundamentally believe that bank users' needs must be recognised. Those who want to use digital services, that's fine. But for the others, there needs to be a means by which they are not left behind. And that has to happen before a decision is taken, not just being informed after a decision is taken. In terms of the committee's point around a forum on banking, which I think is a very interesting suggestion, the committee asked the Scottish Government to call a summit. And as I said at the beginning, because this is an issue that affects all banks, any solution must involve all banks, and therefore they all need to be round the table. Earlier this year, the Scottish Government convened a round-table discussion between the main Scottish banks on the issue of branch closures and the provision of banking services. And the commitment that I can make is to continue to engage with the banks on this issue and in a wider discussion on the role of banking and financial services in supporting Scotland's communities, because there is a whole host of needs out there that need to be recognised. Moving on to rural communities who are particularly affected by the recent closures, we've established a rural community liaison group made up of rural parliament representatives, including Scottish Rural Action, SCVO, the Consumer Council, DTAS, HIE and rural academies. The group has discussed their shared concerns around banking services at a meeting in August, the month just past, and are considering solutions for rural communities. And that brings me on to another point around community groups who have an important role to play in identifying solutions and ensuring the future provision of banking services meets the needs of consumers and businesses across Scotland. And I will continue to engage with these groups to understand and address their concerns. In terms of town centres, branches often, we'll know it ourselves from our own constituencies, have a prominent place in high streets, and their presence is seen by many as a visible sign of the health of the local economy. And we want our towns and town centres to be vibrant, creative, enterprising and accessible. So we need to promote and support the regeneration of Scotland's towns and town centres, including our small towns in rural areas. I want to specifically touch on digital before I close, because I'm also the Minister for the Digital Economy. Choice remains essential. I understand that customers choose to access banking services in different ways, but the problem here has been the speed of change, and change which leaves people behind. There are exciting new ways to support businesses and retail customers with services. Just on Friday, I was talking to branch staff about ways that they can use to intervene on fraud and on scams. But not all customers are able to take advantage of these services. There's no point in pretending that everybody is digital. They are not. And there remain circumstances in which many customers need or prefer to access face-to-face services. Advances in digital technology are changing the way we do so many different things, but people cannot be left behind, and the pace of change needs to reflect customers' need. I've seen many local examples of branch staff supporting customers in using new devices and apps to access services. And there's a duty to educate customers to ensure that no one is left behind before branches are closed. And that's the key message here, that it's not about standing in the way of change. It's about taking people with you, ensuring there is choice, and not leaving the most vulnerable to just pick up the pieces and figure out how they should catch up with everybody else. There's been talk in the report around alternative providers, post offices, and I do welcome the work that the banks are already doing with the post office to expand the services available to their customers. Particularly in rural areas, it's an opportunity for post offices to work with banks and to ensure that the post office remains open. But again, there needs to be adaptations, need to ensure that there's opportunity for private conversations. They need to be accessible, and these discussions need to happen again before the branches are closed. So in summary, I think this is a good report. I think it's a fair contribution to the debate. It demonstrates the need of some customers for face-to-face, and there's an obligation on the banks to ensure that those customers are not left behind.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I call on Dean Lockhart to open for the Conservative Party, to be followed by Jackie Bailey. Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, let me thank colleagues from the committee for bringing forward this report for debate. And I thank the convener for his opening remarks, as well as his number of different quotes, which helps to set out the context for the debate this afternoon. I also join others in thanking the clerks to the committee and SPICE for all their hard work in preparing the report. Today's debate is timely. This week marks the 10th anniversary of the financial crisis, and the committee heard evidence that the structure of the banking sector, the regulatory regime and the relationship between banks and their customers have changed fundamentally following the crisis. In my contribution, I want to cover two main areas: the impact of bank branch closures on individuals and businesses across Scotland, and the related issue of the declining coverage of ATM networks. With respect to bank branch closures, the committee heard evidence that technology and changing customer habits are having an impact on how banks and their customers interact. Martin Kearsley of the Post Office explained that banks are currently undergoing what he described as a once-in-a-generation change, and this is reflected in the way in which we all consume banking services in a different fashion these days. The speed of change is reflected in the growth of online banking, cashless transactions and the ongoing revolution in fintech. Cashless transactions now account for less than 50% of all transactions, with the level of cash transactions in Scotland declining 11% in the past year alone. As we've heard from other members, these trends have resulted in banks cutting back their branch networks in unprecedented numbers. To illustrate the scale of the branch closures recently, the Federation of Small Business has estimated that in 2013 there were more than 1,100 bank branches in Scotland, but this figure will drop to between 700 or 750 by the end of this year. Presiding Officer, it's important that we acknowledge the changing nature of banking and the pressures that banks face, with interest rates lower for longer, increasing regulatory compliance and increasing costs of doing business. However, cost reduction exercises that result in the closure of hundreds of bank branches across Scotland cannot and should not be the answer to these pressures. The reality is that we are not yet a cashless society, and the scale and the speed of recent branch closures has had a negative impact on those most reliant on cash. And this is what the evidence the committee heard from a range of different stakeholders about the impact of branch closures. Concern was expressed by many that closures are having an adverse impact on vulnerable and deprived communities. Age Scotland expressed concern that poor mobility and the lack of public transport will make it difficult for older people to access branches which are more distant. For small retailers, the closure of a local bank branch can have a damaging impact on the business. Small retailers are primarily cash businesses. According to the Scottish Grocers Federation, 76% of its members' business are cash-based. So as a result, many small retailers rely on their local bank for their business needs, and many face insurance requirements to deposit cash at the end of every day of their business. Without having a local bank, these retailers often have to travel 2 to 3 hours to get to their nearest branch, which has an impact on their business, on their productivity, and how they manage their business. The committee also heard evidence that bank branch closures have a disproportionate impact in rural areas, with people living in rural areas having to travel around 40 minutes on average to their bank, often having to use public transport, which itself is experiencing cutbacks. I'm sure members across Parliament will have heard these concerns raised in their own constituencies and regions. In my own region of Mid-Scotland and Fife, I have heard concerns from communities across Bannockburn, Comrie, Dunblane, Leven and Strother and Alloa, areas which have all experienced recent bank branch closures. Yes, I will. Keith Brown.
Keith Brown.
Can I thank Dean Lockhart for taking intervention, and also say that in relation to Dunblane and Alloa, which of course is my constituency, which has no Clydesdale and no RBS branches left at all, I think the only constituency in Scotland, would he join me in saying the remedy here lies with the regulating authority, the UK government, which also happens to be the biggest shareholder in RBS, and would he condemn the complete failure of the 2 local Tory MPs to make any impact in reversing some of these decisions?
Dean Lockhart.
Well, thank Keith Brown for that intervention. With regard to the UK government and its shareholding in RBS, RBS, as you know, is an independent listed company, so it's legally not possible for the government under London Stock Exchange listing rules to interfere with the independent board of RBS. The other evidence we heard at the committee, while the evidence was largely negative of the impact of bank branch closures, some evidence highlighted that it only has a limited effect. Professor Griggs told the committee that, in his words, there is no long-term empirical evidence to show that there is an adverse effect on bank branch closures. But that has to be said, that was in the minority of the evidence we received. So taking into account all the evidence presented, the committee reached the following conclusions. First, many people have indeed experienced negative impact from bank closures. There's no doubt that the rate and the scale of bank closures have adversely affected people and businesses in a number of different ways. However, the committee felt it wasn't in a position to build a comprehensive picture of the overall impact across Scotland. From the evidence we heard, it's clear there is an urgent need for a systematic study of the impact of bank closures on people and business in Scotland and indeed across the UK. Such a study would map out the current provision of banking services and, more importantly, what future provision would look like, so that there is a universal banking provision in all areas of Scotland. These are issues that involve policy areas which are both reserved and devolved. So this is an area in which we call on the Scottish Government to work together with the UK Government to ensure we have a better understanding of the current and the future banking needs in Scotland. Let me move on to the ATM coverage, because the customers are also having to deal with the threat of a declining ATM network in Scotland. The importance of local ATMs has only increased following closure of bank branches, as ATMs are now often the only means for people across Scotland to access cash and banking services. Given the importance of ATMs, there was real concern earlier this year when the UK's largest cash point network, Linked, announced plans to change the fee structure under which ATM operators are paid. Given these concerns, I led a members' debate in this chamber in May, and the Economy Committee here in Holyrood, along with the Scottish Affairs Committee at Westminster, have heard evidence of the impact that these changing fee structures would have on ATM provision. It was therefore a positive development to hear in July Link announced that the planned third cut to the interchange fee to 21.25 pence in January 2020 has been cancelled, and the fourth reduction, taking the fees down to 20 pence, is now on hold pending a review. I think a good example of how here and in other places we can influence decision-making with the regulator. It's clear that any assessment that we have called for banking services have to look at the availability of bank branch networks and ATMs in the round. They go hand in hand. Reflecting this, the committee's conclusion with respect to ATM provision in the future was clear. The committee recommended that the ATM network should have independent oversight and that the provision of ATMs should be included in any revised statutory arrangements put in place following revision of the Access to Banking standard. Presiding Officer, let me conclude by emphasising that the committee will continue to monitor developments in this area. Gordon Gekko, not Gordon Lyndhurst, said that money never sleeps, and this is an issue that the committee will remain wide awake on. We look forward to receiving a positive response from all key stakeholders involved, and both the Scottish Government and the UK Government, with respect to the recommendations set out in the report.
Thank you very much. I now call on Jackie Bailey to open for the Labour Party, to be followed by Mike Rumbles. Jackie Bailey. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And let me start by declaring an interest. I bank with the Royal Bank of Scotland. I've done so for the past 40 years. And whilst my comments relate to other banks, I am going to talk about my bank in particular because I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that despite the wave upon wave of branch closures, the withdrawal of support from many of our businesses, the real anger at creating cash deserts in many of our communities, the Royal Bank carry on regardless. And whilst the Royal Bank of Scotland is not alone, the hollowness of their claims of being the last bank in town leaves a sour taste in the mouth. The scale of the closures have been breathtaking. No wonder RBS was reticent about sharing the numbers with the committee. They started with 334 branches. They now have 99, a staggering 70% reduction, the highest of all the banks. TSB had the fewest closures, with a reduction, though, of 18%. So RBS has gone from the bank with the most branches to third place. And the reason RBS and other banks are content to carry on and not adjust their behaviour in response to our concerns is because, let's face it, of the stickiness of their customers. We, their customers, we don't like change. We tend not to leave the bank. Yet it's fair to say that not very many of us are particularly happy. Now, I wonder if we started switching banks as we are encouraged to do with other utilities, whether that would make them sit up and listen. I wonder if there is a comparison site that we can use for different banking products. But during the committee's inquiry, we were constantly told that the customers are changing, their needs are changing. We live in a digital age. People want online banking. We want speed, we want convenience, and apparently we don't want to visit branches anymore. The committee heard that this was not the case for the majority of older or vulnerable people. Well, I clearly must be old, because I like visiting my bank branch. I'm not alone, as the queues will testify, nor, Presiding Officer, am I the youngest person there. There are people of all ages in my local branch, and I'm joined in those queues by local businesses. And I keep asking myself, if bank branches are so unpopular and so undated, why are there always queues when I happen to visit? Now, Pete Cheemer of the Scottish Grocers Federation told the committee that the needs of commercial banking appear to have been completely ignored. Bank branches have closed due to an apparent decline in personal banking, but that's not the case with commercial banking, where demand has not reduced at all. Yet it seems that their real need for cash is a secondary consideration. That's what businesses told us. Firstly, although debit cards have for the first time overtaken cash, cash remains the second most frequent form of payment. My colleague Keir Collin was telling me how he was caught in an embarrassing situation. I know he's going to hate the fact that I'm going to be repeating it, where he was treating people for a cup of tea, but there was no machine for his card. He needed cash. They had a whip round to pay for that. He does tell me that he's going to treat them all in future, and I'm sure they will hold him to that. But in the retail sector, 76% of businesses use cash. FSB Scotland report that cash remains the most popular payment method for their members. That means that businesses need a facility to deposit cash and to get change. The consequence of branches closing has meant that businesses need to travel further to bank. It takes more time, and some even pay as much as £8,000 a year for a pick-up, a collection service. And with less frequent
deposits, more money retained by the store, the risk increases, and so do the insurance premiums. Now, I watched an advert last night from RBS. The strapline was one of the many ways you can bank with RBS. I commend it to the Chamber, because what you would see is a mobile van, a cash machine outside a chippy, Honest Angus with his sheep, I'm not sure what he was supposed to symbolise, and Dodgy Davy with a face recognition mobile app. What you didn't see, and I watched it twice just to make sure, was a branch. Not anywhere, clearly so passé, they are now wiped out of adverts completely. We were told about alternatives when we considered this at the committee. Post offices were suggested, but don't forget there's been a programme of post office closures. There is also an upper limit on the value of individual transactions, which is not helpful to commercial customers. Then there are mobile branches undoubtedly useful in very rural and remote areas. Some customers, though, have raised concerns about disability access. For many of them, their main concern is frequency. Instead of a branch that they could call into any time, they get a van, which stops for an hour once a fortnight. And in my area, it took 18 months after closing the Alexandria branch for RBS to decide to provide us with a mobile van, for which I'm grateful. But what about ATMs? That same Alexandria branch that closed had an ATM. It has a history of breaking down and being out of action. And we are told that the trend with branch closures will soon be the trend with ATMs as banks and other providers remove free ATMs from our communities. Link is reducing the ATM charge, which might lead to a loss of machines. Now, Link told us that they're committed to maintaining free ATMs in rural and deprived areas, and that's a good thing. They also told us that they'll maintain a free ATM in every community that currently has one by protecting the interchange rate for all existing free ATMs within 1 kilometre of another. That's actually quite far away, and particularly in a rural area, that might mean that some don't have ATMs at all. So having illustrated the impact on personal customers, on commercial businesses, and on our high streets, what can we do? Well, I agree with the call for independent oversight of ATMs. We need to stop the withdrawal of them now before it becomes a trend in the way that bank branch closures have become. Of course, encouraging the development of financial institutions like credit unions, expanding common bond areas, and ensuring an increased range of financial services are important. The Scottish Government can help by providing the infrastructure and development support so that we can grow that network. The committee, as you've already heard, recommended that the Scottish Government should convene a summit to look at the options to protect customers and protect our high streets. And I hope the Minister responds positively to that. But let me turn, as I finish, Presiding Officer, to the Access to Banking Code. Set up as a voluntary code by the UK Government and industry, there are at least two major flaws with it. The first, that it applies to consultation after the bank has decided to close the branch, not before, but after. There is little chance of meaningful community input. It is simply an exercise in telling you what the alternatives are. I don't think it's made a material difference to the outcome of any proposed branch closure. And the second problem with it is that it's voluntary. There's no requirement to do this, and for some it appears to be a tick box exercise. Now, people tell me that we can't interfere in the decisions of banks because they are private companies. I didn't see anyone saying that when we were bailing out the banks with billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. Indeed, the last time I looked, the taxpayer still owns the majority shareholding in the Royal Bank of Scotland. Interesting that whilst they are happy to accept our interference and help from the taxpayer, they don't want to offer us anything in exchange. The consultation should be upfront before a decision is made, and that is exactly what Scottish Labour and the UK Labour Party believes that the Access to Banking Code should do. It should be given statutory underpinning. There should be mandatory consultations on bank branch closures before decisions are made. Presiding Officer, it is disappointing that the people who caused the crisis are not the ones who will suffer the consequences. Instead, what we have is ordinary people suffering the loss of bank branches on their high streets. And I hope the Scottish Government and UK Government act in the interests of our communities.
Thank you. I call Mike Grumbles before we move to the open part of the debate. Mike Grumbles.
Well, like Jackie Bailey, I was a customer of RBS, but unlike Jackie Bailey, I'm no longer one of their customers, and perhaps I'll explain why in my contribution. First, I'd like to thank the Economy and Jobs and Fair Work Committee for producing the report, which we're debating. Their remit, and it's worth looking at the remit again, to examine the impact of bank branch closures in Scotland on local businesses, consumers and the Scottish economy, and to explore what steps can be taken to address any issues identified by the committee. That's a really important remit. Now, over the last few years, as we've heard, our banks have steadily withdrawn their presence from particularly rural Scotland. This has to have had a major impact on the ability of our small businesses and individual customers to conduct their financial affairs. Now, the impact came home to me as a resident of rural Aberdeenshire, and rather than use the anecdotal evidence of any of my constituents, because I wouldn't want to name them, I'll use my own experience as an example. Travelling from my home in Kildrummy, some 7 miles from Afford, my nearest village with a bank, I used at the time the branch of the Royal Bank of Scotland to pay in our business takings. In September 2015, they closed the branch and advised me that I could easily use either their Bankery branch, some 26 miles away, or their West Hill branch, some 27 miles away from my home. I declined to do this, but I do know many people who moved their accounts. Can you imagine how those customers, the ones that moved their accounts, felt? Well, in September last year, RBS closed its Bankery branch and quickly followed again the next month by closing its West Hill branch. Never mind, the nearest RBS branch was in Huntly, just 21 miles north of Afford. So what did RBS do just 8 months later? Yes, you've guessed it, presiding officer, they closed down their Huntly branch too. So those people who had moved from all of those branches over those 3 years when RBS closed all 4 down, if anybody wanted to do face-to-face banking, they had to visit their travelling bank, and we've just heard about those, and in my case, take the 66-mile round trip to Aberdeen. You know, I have to ask whether it would have been more sensible to have closed all of these branches down at the same time. I know he wouldn't have liked it, but would it not have been more sense, rather than mess all those people about, jumping from branch to branch over those 3 years? So anecdotally, the difficulties faced by small businesses and individuals was obvious. What we needed was an evidence-based investigation into those difficulties, and that's why I'm pleased to see that the committee has taken up the challenge. I welcome their conclusions. They state, 1, that the most vulnerable in our communities are most affected. 2, that there are indeed difficulties being experienced by community groups and charities in particular, church groups in particular, in accessing banking services with their collections in cash. That cash is still essential for some businesses, and that these closures have impacted on productivity, which will impact on Scotland's economy as a whole. Now, we all know that regulation of our banks is a reserved matter for the UK government and the UK Parliament, of course. So it didn't surprise me to see that there weren't that many recommendations produced in the committee's report. Its main recommendation, and I quote, to ask the UK government to urgently carry out a study on the impact of bank closures across the UK, it is welcome, but it does indicate to me something of a lost opportunity. Now, I wasn't privy to the discussions surrounding the decision by the committee to proceed with the investigation they have in the way that it has. Obviously, those discussions take place in private session. So I hope that members of the committee, and perhaps the convener, will forgive me if you've already examined what I'm about to say and decided that was either too difficult or too impractical to proceed in this way. But considering banking and financial services is a reserve matter, would this not have been an ideal opportunity for our 2 parliaments, here at Holyrood and at Westminster, to work together on an inquiry to produce a joint report? I would really like to know if the committee explored this opportunity, and I'm happy to listen in a further contribution or even take an intervention. Delighted, thank you.
Gillian Martin.
Should the member be aware that the Scottish Affairs Committee actually did do its own inquiry, and there were some of the issues that they discussed which they didn't take forward, which was an opportunity for us to fill in the gaps, as it were. So I'm not sure if you're aware of that having happened.
Mike Rumbles.
I thank Gillian and Martin for that intervention, and I am indeed aware of that. But I actually think it's important on an issue like this, which is a reserved matter for regulation and has such an impact on devolved matters, that we could have been a little bit more, dare I say it, adventurous in working together. Now, I don't know if that was examined by the committee, and I'd like to think it would be, but surely it is a lesson, perhaps, when we look to the future, to examine whether we could, in fact, work together in the two parliaments that represent the people of Scotland. I think that would be ideal. As I'm looking for practical recommendations, and I realise I'm running out of time. So basically, as I say, I don't want to be too harsh on the committee. Not at all. I think the committee have done a good report, and I can see the convener smiling. I hope I'm not being sounding too critical. But I do actually think it was a missed opportunity to break new ground, and I think we should be interested in breaking new ground. And let's be a little bit more adventurous, because we could address the issues that the committee have identified in practical ways and do it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to the open part of the debate, and I call Keith Brown to be followed by Edward Mountain. Keith Brown.
I welcome the publication of the Economy, Jobs and Fair Work Committee's report into the closure programme, which I think correctly identifies the significant negative impact this will have for communities such as those facing bank closures in my own constituency. Those closures will, as I've mentioned, make the Clackmannanshire and Dunblane constituency the only one, I believe, in Scotland without an RBS or a Clydesdale branch, and many of my constituents will rightly ask why their Westminster parliamentary representatives failed to take any effective action to oppose these closures. Various explanations, as we've heard, have been offered by the banks to account for these closures. I'm less concerned, as Dean Lockhart was, to recognise the pressures that the banks face. I'm much more inclined to think about the pressures that my constituents face. Since 2010, Clydesdale Bank and RBS have closed 53% and 70% of their branches respectively. And it's fair to say those closures have occurred without prior consultation with businesses or the communities they were supposed to serve. On the 1st of December 2017, RBS announced its intention to close 62 branches across Scotland, leading to the loss of 158 jobs. Of course, the closures would result in the loss of the last branch in town for many communities, contrary to the commitment given by RBS in 2010. With the Tory UK government taking no interest and no position on the closures, despite its majority ownership of RBS with taxpayers' money. In my constituency, 3 branches of RBS in Alloa, Bridge of Allen and Dunblane were earmarked for closure. Instead of demanding action from the RBS-owning Tory government, the 2 Tory MPs currently representing these areas fell into line and backed the inaction and indifference of the UK government, which did absolutely nothing to delay or halt these closures, despite having a majority ownership of RBS. It is clear to me that little thought has been given to the impacts that these closures have upon communities. I will do.
Dean Lockhart.
I just wanted to repeat the discussion we had earlier about legally the UK government not being able to interfere with the RBS independent board decisions. Is that something Keith Brown acknowledges?
Keith Brown.
I think, as Jackie Bailey mentioned earlier on, given the extent of powers held by the UK government, reserve powers held in terms of regulation and banking, and given the stakeholder, the taxpayer stakeholder you have in RBS, there is plenty of scope for action for the UK government to take, and it's chosen to take no action at all. Otherwise, why would some of your colleagues have asked the UK government to take action? So I think that proves it is perfectly possible. And it quite rightly notes, the report, that it's the vulnerable in our communities who stand to be most affected by bank branch closures. And at a time as well when benefit reforms being imposed by the Tory UK government are causing such damage to so many vulnerable people in the constituencies we represent, and placing such emphasis on people's ability to manage their own finances effectively, if you think only of the universal credit changes, I recently held a summit where, again, the 2 Tory MPs refused to attend and the DWP didn't even respond to the invitation to come along. The fact that people are being asked to take more responsibility for their money surely means that bank branches being closed is particularly perverse and unwelcome. The committee report notes that with the changes in banking provision, it's vital that people continue to have access to financial services, to financial support and to cash. And it's those who have limited access to bank accounts, indeed the unbanked as they're called, and cards who are at most risk of being excluded. And that's an important finding, and one that as a Parliament we have to press the UK Government for action on. Following my own discussions with RBS about the impact of the closure programme in my constituency, I was assured that post offices offer many of the face-to-face services offered by banks, and that therefore communities facing bank closures would not see the loss of services to the extent that was feared. But in Alloa, for example, which is the main town in Clackmannanshire, a decision was taken to close a dedicated Crown post office, with reduced services moved to a few counters inside a local shop. That post office is extremely busy, with long queues common at peak times and a lack of privacy for people and businesses to discuss what, after all, should be private concerning their personal finance matters. And as Jackie Bailey also mentioned, there's a £2,000 deposit limit for walk-in transactions, and businesses that wanted to make deposits greater than £2,000 have to arrange for cash to be deposited at a pre-arranged time. Not exactly a flexible service that's accountable for the varying needs of businesses. So I think it's unfair to suggest that post offices offer a comparable alternative to a bank branch for either personal or business customers. I should say, Mike Rumble said that we should be more adventurous. Well, I'll make a suggestion that might not be feasible, but why do the public authorities in Scotland, local councils, other public authorities say, well, we think it's quite important we have a physical presence that provides banking services. We think it's important that we provide financial education. We think it's important that we don't ask somebody on universal credit to get 2 buses from Alloa into Stirling so they can pick up a universal credit payment. So because of that, we will set up our own bank. We will put our deposits and our monies into a community bank, which then can be available, can be accessed through different physical premises in the constituencies and areas around Scotland, and allow people to have that level of control. If the banks want to create these deserts, and they've created one in Clackmannanshire and Dunblane, then it's time for us to irrigate the system again. And why can't some public authorities look to that? I just mention it as a suggestion. And also in Dunblane, in my constituency, a community organisation approached RBS with the hope of taking over the premises when it became vacant. They hoped to use the premises for a social enterprise which focused on employability skills and training, including financial training. However, disappointingly, the response from RBS was that the building would be put in the open market before considering the community's request. As has been the case across Scotland, the reaction in Clackmannanshire and Dunblane has been overwhelmingly negative, and that includes amongst business owners who rely on the convenience of local banking services. In February, I received a response from the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn, which stated that the UK Government does believe that banks should act in the best interest of their customers. However, it's clear from the evidence that this simply is not the case, and I fully endorse the calls of the committee that the UK Government must carry out a further study into the impact of bank closures with a view to identifying the statutory and regulatory changes required, which will ensure the wider impacts are fully considered and in the best interests of customers and communities.
Thank you. I call Edward Mountain to be followed by Gillian Martin. Mr Mountain, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Economy, Jobs and Fair Work Committee for their report on bank closures. I don't need to remind anyone that it was nearly a decade ago that retail banks committed themselves to restoring the consumer confidence which they had lost during the financial crash of 2009. Banks set out to rebuild that vital relationship with local communities and local businesses. And the RBS, I have to admit, my bank even boasted in an advert that it was here for you wherever you may live. Back then, RBS had the most branches across Scotland, and more than any other bank. How times have changed. Since 2010, RBS have closed 235 local branches, a 70% reduction. That is the bank that promised it would not shut the last branch in a town, and it's just doing that right now. To quote the committee, this was clearly a hollow promise. Now, the Highlands and Islands region will be one of the hardest hit areas, with about 52 bank closures in the region. Branches along with their ATMs have already been closed in Mallock, Nairn, Aviemore, Granton-on-Spey, Inverness, Tain and Wick. 3 branches in Beaulieu, Kyle and Tongue are still threatened with closure, but have a stay of execution pending an independent review by Johnston & Carmichael. If the independent review advises those branches remain open, then we are told the RBS will honour that recommendation. I would welcome that, but a consultation should have happened long before RBS made their initial decision to close the branches. Therefore, I welcome the committee's conclusion that access to banking standard is failing in its current form and recommends it's replaced with a statutory model which makes it a requirement for banks to consult before a decision is made to close a branch. Whilst it's true many more people use digital banking these days, having a branch on your local high street is still important, and more important than ever, especially in rural communities in the Highlands which remain unconnected to superfast broadband. Let's not forget the Highlands was meant to have superfast broadband by the end of this Parliament. Under this government, Highlanders will have to wait till at least the end of 2021 for superfast broadband, a target that may slip further. So for many, internet banking is still a dream. Homes and businesses left in the digital slow lane cannot access digital banking. And when digital banking is not available, banks are keen to stress that mobile banking is the next best option. But is it? As this report highlights, many retail banks such as TSB and Santander don't have mobile vans, and those that do, such as RBS, are cutting the time they spend at each location they visit. Last May, stops in Kingussie were cut from 45 minutes to 20 minutes, and from 30 minutes to 15 minutes in Boat Garden. Even more concerning is the fact that some of the vans are not accessible to people with reduced mobility. I therefore welcome the committee's recommendation that RBS must review the disabled access to its vans as a matter of priority. I also share the committee's concerns regarding the Post Office's ability to fill the gap left by banks. There is great potential when it comes to providing basic retail banking service in Post Office, but that does not help business banking. Services such as cheque clearing are often processed more slowly, and inter-account transfers and currency exchange are not always available. As the regional chair of the Federation of Small Businesses of the Highlands and Islands stated last year, business needs somewhere to bank cash, but neither the post office nor mobile vans, the latter only visiting once or twice a week, would suffice. Business and customers need the reassurance of a local bank branch alongside a first-class digital service. There's no reason why they shouldn't get the best of both worlds. Presiding officer, I accept the way we bank is changing, but as the report states, banks are also driving the pace of change. They do so, I believe, without comprehending the impact on their customers in the remote rural areas. In these areas, they need to take their foot off the accelerator. Digital banking, mobile banking and post office banking are not viable alternatives that work for all. There is still a need for bank branches on our local high street. And to me, it is clear that this report states that not enough thought has been put into the decision to close branches. And I call now on RBS to review how it serves rural communities across the Highlands and across Scotland, because what it is doing at the moment does not serve those communities that it's meant to. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I can say there's a little time in hand, so I can be a little elastic with the timings, not too elastic, just a little elastic, but not so that it snaps. I call Gillian Martin to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Miss Martin, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to thank the Economy, Jobs and Fair Work Committee for bringing this debate on the report to the Chamber. This inquiry was held while I was a member of that committee, membership that I enjoyed immensely for 2 years. Before I talk about the report into banking closures, if I can be indulged, Presiding Officer, I want to put on record my thanks to the Convener Gordon Lyndhurst, Deputy Convener John Mason and all the other committee members and the hard-working team of committee clerks led by Ali Walker. During the inquiry into the closures of the last bank in town, I went with the committee clerks to Mintlaw, which saw its only bank closed in 2017. There we met with business owners and were able to get a feeling for the disadvantage that they felt. As the report heard time and time again in evidence, the banking of cash was a major issue, particularly around taking a long time out of the business day to bank cash in other towns, time they couldn't really spare. Post office provision still exists in Mintlaw, but again, many other business owners from across Scotland who gave evidence this says there were two major issues with that. One was lack of confidentiality, and a feeling of lack of security, particularly when carrying large amounts of cash. And then, as has been mentioned, the fact that they were limited in the amount of cash that they could bank at any one time. In Mint Law, it was only due to intervention from myself as the local MSP and my colleague Councillor Jim Ingram that a cash machine was installed, or else Mint Law would have had absolutely no access to cash at all. At our outreach meeting, we heard from a farmer who also made a very good point about the continued use of cheques at local marts. He said he would get a cheque for selling his livestock and could be paying a cheque worth thousands of pounds in each time. I had similar conversations with constituents in Turriff, constituents who have just lost their Royal Bank, constituents who ran charities and community groups who got their subscriptions or donations in cash and cheques still and would struggle to get to a bank miles away from them. And it should be remembered that a lot of these groups are staffed by volunteers who also work during the day, so not having a bank branch on their doorstep is really problematic. Other members, I'm sure, will mention the social inclusion aspect of bank branch closures on the elderly and those in low incomes in particular. You can't internet bank if you don't own a computer. And many elderly and disabled people find accessing mobile vans difficult, as we've heard. Mint Law was fortunate that the premises the Clydesdale Bank vacated didn't stay empty for long. But this seems to be a rather unusual situation. During evidence on the impact of empty bank buildings on a high street was one of the most compelling pieces of evidence. Buildings could fall into disrepair. The removal of the bank would impact on the footfall of neighbouring shops. And little or no effort was made by the banks to offer their buildings to community groups or business start-ups if they'd been standing empty with no real prospect for sale in the future. And it was interesting to hear Keith Brown mention a particular incident of that. We were struck by the evidence we heard on what consultation banks did or did not do with customers and how they communicated subsequent closure decisions to customers. In particular, I was confused at the value of having an access to banking standard that didn't, one, compel banks to consult with their customers ahead of making decisions on closures, and two, was supervised by the Lending Standards Board, which is made up of the banks themselves, effectively self-policing, or in most cases, not policing at all. And although the standard asked banks to communicate on closures with customers, this often wasn't being followed. In Mint Law, customers complained that they get told about the closure of their bank either very close to the closure date, or in some cases they weren't told at all. Certainly, none of the customers we spoke to in all the evidence gathering were consulted beforehand on what they used the bank for and what impact its closure might have on their business or their community. Many of our witnesses mentioned that, contrary to the standard, they were only made aware of alternative banking methods after a branch was closed, and I think that's simply unacceptable. The Federation of Small Businesses colourfully described the banking standard as a paper tiger, and in the evidence I heard, I have to agree with them. So the committee were keen to go where the Scottish Affairs Committee in Westminster did not go when they put in the recommendation in the report that the access to banking standard has to be looked at again with a clear view on becoming much more customer-focused. One of our key recommendations was to rewrite the standard to include a consultation with all customers, businesses and the local community when assessing whether a branch should be closed. We also asked questions on how a bank's assessment on footfall was carried out. In counting footfall, some banks would only count transactions made by their own branch customers. Now, I nip into Santander fairly regularly, but I can't remember the last time that I visited my own branch, which is near my old work in George Street in Aberdeen. And it's not exactly handy for me anymore, but I still go into a branch. But by these rules, I wouldn't be counted as using a branch. And they also said that they might only look at regular use. Well, quite what the definition of regular is, depending on the bank's own thoughts, and I'd suggest motivations. The Economy's inquiry probably made very uncomfortable viewing for the banks. But with bank closures continuing apace, particularly, as we mentioned so many times already today, in rural communities, I believe we made some very important recommendations and found some pretty compelling evidence that I hope gives them pause for thought, but most importantly, gives rise to customers being at the centre of closure decisions.
Thank you. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Rachel Hamilton. Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate, and I want to offer my thanks to colleagues across the Parliament who actually helped produce this informative report. Committee reports and committee work sometimes doesn't always obtain the coverage that it deserves, but I think that this report actually has been well received, and it's certainly something that I thought was certainly something of a report that actually had a lot of information in it, but also something of use to that wider debate in terms of banking in the high streets today. Presiding Officer, paragraph 53, page 8, sets out the changing nature of banking, and it's fair to say that the traditional banking activities will not suit everyone. Online banking is increasing, and this will not decrease in the years ahead. And Presiding Officer, I want to focus my comments now actually just on my own constituency. I mean, like others already have spoken, and no doubt others after me, they're going to touch upon issues regarding their own constituency, and I'm going to do the same. Greenock and Inverclyde has lost banks in Port Glasgow, Gourock and also Greenock, and in recent years the Royal Bank of Scotland they closed their branch in West Blackhall Street and moved the services to its Cathcart Street branch, just at the other end of the town centre. Now, I am an RBS customer, and I have been for many, many years. This decision, although actually disappointing, it wasn't really campaigned against, because customers could actually see the logic, because they weren't losing a bank from the town centre, and the Cathcart Street branch was been there for many, many years, so it wasn't actually a huge change or huge detriment to the town centre. So there wasn't a big campaign against it. And it was certainly something that I didn't receive anybody, nobody contacted me to complain about that particular decision. But this summer, I was informed that the RBS, they now want to close that Cathcart Street branch and move the facilities to the mortgage centre, which is less than 1 mile away. Now, 1 mile in a town centre, it might not seem like a lot. Certainly 1 mile in a rural area might be a bit different, and obviously colleagues have touched upon having to go to a bank maybe 20 miles or so away. But I genuinely disagree with this decision that the RBS have put forward. I disagree with it for a variety of reasons. First of all, moving the bank out of the town centre to the basically the outskirts of the town, in between two stations, it's going to take away people actually having the chance to actually go off a train and go to and go down to the bank, which is literally 100 metres away. Secondly, although the distance isn't really that far away, its location means that customers who actually do go to it, well, they actually need to plan their visit in addition to doing any of their other activities. But this I mean that at the moment, with the Cathcart Street branch in the town centre, folk can actually go into the bank. You can also go and spend money in other parts of the town centre. I mean, there's a cafe just downstairs, and there's also other shops just downstairs. So taking it out of the town centre takes away that economic opportunity. And thirdly, I do not believe that consultation has been done. When I, in conjunction with the other politicians I'll touch upon in a moment, we contacted the RBS and asked them a number of questions and raised issues. And one of the things that they said back to me was that actually they'd consulted. Now, as a customer, I wasn't consulted, but the level of consultation was, apparently they had somebody in the Cathcart Street branch, and when folk came in, they just asked them a couple of questions. Now, I don't think that's consultation. I don't think that's good enough when it comes to actually removing that particular facility from the town centre. I mentioned a moment ago that a few of us wrote, and a joint letter was sent by Mike Russell MSP, Brendan O'Hara MP, Ronnie Cowan MP, and myself to the RBS expressing our concerns and also anger at the decision. Indeed, certainly my colleagues who represent Argyll and Bute, they raised their concerns because last December, when they were informed that the Rossi branch was going to close, their customers were told that actually they can go and use the Cathcart Street branch in Greenock Town Centre. Now, this takes the branch further away from Rossi and its customers, and also makes it more challenging for those customers who actually rely upon the issue of public transport to actually get to Greenock. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Greenock Central Station is just across the road from the Cathcart Street branch, whereas the mortgage centre is right in the middle between Greenock Central Station and the Cartstike Station. Now, except that the Cathcart Street branch is not perfect, and the costs for the building may well actually be expensive in future years. So I genuinely wouldn't criticise the RBS for attempting to future-proof their business in terms of customer certainly customer offer. But I believe this is a step too far. Now, colleagues from across the chamber have highlighted the wide variety of issues today, including accessibility, and the Age Scotland briefing highlights various points, including that 67% of people over 75 not using the internet. Now, with a constituency with an ageing population, and over the course of the next 5 years, the over 65 population will actually be increasing to 25%. Then this clearly indicates that banks need to fully consider all their customers. Now, Dean Lockhart earlier spoke about the devolved and reserved matters, and also suggested that the Scottish Government and UK Government should actually be working together. Now, I agree with them on this point, and I don't usually agree with Tories, but I agree with them on this point. But the UK Government must also use its influence. 70% of the stake in the RBS is actually should be utilised to help the communities and also our constituents. Now, paragraph 128, page 26 of the report asks the Scottish Government, local authorities and banks to work together. I agree, but also agree with Mike Rumbles, who's unfortunately not here at the moment, and I certainly won't make a habit of agreeing with Mike Rumbles. But Mike Rumbles made the point, that possibly too many of the recommendations have let the UK Government off the hook. And with that, I agree with him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I call Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Joan McAlpine. Ms Hamilton, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking the Economy, Jobs and Fair Work Committee for their report. Presiding Officer, from post office closures to bank branch closures, the demise of the town centre has greatly impacted upon everyone, all of us here in the Chamber. The Royal Bank of Scotland's latest round of closures was amongst the worst for my constituents. Towns and villages left without a bank. Where the bank did once proudly sit on the high street, there is now a vacant, unsightly property left behind. However, I'd like to say that Ettrick Forest Interiors have moved into the bank in Selkirk, which is a welcome addition to the high street. So perhaps there is some opportunities for other businesses to move in. And I hope that Royal Bank of Scotland will work with local businesses to make that happen. The decision to close branches wasn't founded on solid and robust evidence. Royal Bank of Scotland failed to carry out proper consultation before closing the branches, and I think this is an insult to customers, given their best interests clearly weren't taken into consideration from day one. Access to banking standard should require banks to consult directly with customers as part of their impact study. Loyal customers who have banked with RBS for generations were left in the lurch, with no option to move bank or face an arduous journey. Sorry, the only option was to move bank or face the arduous journey to their nearest branch. And in a digital era where we can do online banking with convenience, if you can and if you know how, with the ease of a mobile phone, the local branch might become redundant, but for many it remains an absolute necessity because of the lack of digital skills that some people have. Presiding Officer, there is an assumption made by RBS that the Post Office would automatically pick up the slack for their departure from the High Street. It was expected that they would deliver the services that RBS once did, and the fact remains the Post Office is simply not an alternative for a bank branch. It offers a simple cash deposit and withdrawal service and has now become the place that businesses, local businesses on the high street are having to rely on. RBS failed to realise that the Post Office cannot provide the full range of services as RBS did. And what is most worrying, can I finish this sentence, is worrying that the bank have actually taken a gamble in assuming that the Post Office will deal with the aftermath of the bank closures. I'll take an intervention.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I take the point she makes that the Post Office cannot provide all the services, but I don't know what her experience was, but when we went out to Leven, the people showed us a letter from the Royal Bank and it didn't even mention that any services were available in the Post Office. I wonder if her experience is any different, if the Royal Bank has encouraged people, as far as she knows, to actually use the Post Office.
Rachel Hamilton. I thank John Mason for that intervention, and I had a similar experience within my own constituency. There was no direct link between businesses being given that advice. They just presumed that that's what they would have to do. And in some instances, there was uncertainty with regard to the sustainability of the postmaster in the town itself. So therefore, the Royal Bank of Scotland presuming that the Post Office were going to be the alternative service clearly wasn't the case, because they hadn't done their due diligence with the postmaster and the service that they were providing. But in many rural and remote villages in my constituency, there simply, as I've just said, isn't the luxury of the Post Office to fall back on for banking when the last bank leaves town. Simply put, it is unacceptable for RBS to assume that the Post Office will always be there in the case of a bank closure. And more and more we learn that even Plan B options of ATMs and mobile banking vans aren't providing the reliable services that customers expect. There are parts of the area that I represent, such as Liddesdale, for example, that are almost an hour round trip to their nearest branch of RBS as a direct result of the closures. I'm glad the committee report acknowledges that RBS promised that they would not shut the last bank branch in the town, but that was completely ignored. And what RBS have failed to recognise is that many people who live in these remote and rural areas are older and more vulnerable, and they now face these long journeys to their nearest branch, which is just unacceptable. The committee found that 67% of people over the age of 75 in Scotland do not use the internet. It's really disgraceful that elderly constituents, often without access to a car or a bus service, are just left with very little in the way of options other than the mobile banking vans. On that note, the mobile banking routes could help alleviate some of the issues. However, the services they offer are often unreliable and irregular. And many constituents have complained, again, in places like Hoyk, of standing in a queue waiting for the service, and then the tellers tell them that they actually have to move on quickly to the next stop, so they haven't got time to actually deal with the inquiry. So it's not working as perfectly as I think RBS have expected. I also want to give an example of in Eyemouth. I met a gentleman who is a wheelchair user, and he went to the mobile bank and he went to do just a simple transaction. The teller came out of the bank onto the street, which was on a pavement which was totally unsuitable. The weather was blowing a gale, as it sometimes does on the coast in Eyemouth, and it just really wasn't suitable either for hearing for that gentleman or possibly the dignity and respectful transaction that should be going on inside and in comfort. I have to say that after all my rant about the RBS, community bankers actually have been rather helpful, and they are working with communities in libraries and leisure centres and carrying out home visits, and also to help grasp digital skills. I don't know how much time I've got. You did say there was a bit more time, Presiding Officer. I've got a few more points.
Yes, and you also took an intervention.
Okay,
so
thank you, Presiding Officer. I just want to touch on the ATMs, which many people today have talked about. And we're learning from new figures from Link just last week and they are the largest cash machine network in the UK, that 250 ATMs are vanishing each month. And Age Scotland have noted that the loss of free-to-use ATMs will result in older people having to make withdrawals and being charged up to 30% from fee-paying machines. And I welcome the recommendation in the committee's report which calls for ATMs to have their provision independently overseen, and that any revised statutory arrangements are put in place following the revision of the Access to Banking Standard. To conclude, rural Scotland has really taken a massive blow with these closures, and we've heard so many contributions today that echo what I'm saying too. I'm glad that the Economy Committee have concluded this in their report, and it is right and proper that RBS are held to account and that more can be done in the future to avoid this happening. It causes significant stress and inconvenience to many of our constituents, and loyal customers have been disregarded, towns left without a bank, and now ATMs being removed. It's time a proper study was carried out to highlight where RBS can help these communities and to mitigate against further closures. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Colin Smith. Ms McAlpine, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank all members of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for producing such a comprehensive and timely report on a subject of great concern to my constituents across South of Scotland region. I particularly welcome the committee's call for RBS branch closures to be put on hold or cancelled so that a proper study can look at the impact and scale of closures across Scotland, although for many in my constituency it's too little and too late because the banks have already closed. Earlier this year, RBS, a bank, as others have said, owned 60% by taxpayers, announced plans to close 16 branches across South of Scotland. And this came on top of extensive closures previously announced by RBS and the Bank of Scotland. And these aren't just closures in villages. They lost their banks a good few years ago. These are closures in large market towns, serving large rural areas and supporting villages, hamlets and farms. And of course, the branch closures have been compounded by, as others have said, the loss of ATMs on our high streets. And I just wanted to reflect that earlier Jackie Bailey talked about her loyalty to banks. I too am an RBS customer and have been since I was a student, which was a long time ago. But I've been struck by the complete contempt that RBS show to their customers right across my constituency. And I have to say to myself as well, as an MSP, I, like many other members, contacted the Chief Executive of RBS, Ross McEwen, raising the concerns of my constituents and explaining the impact this decision would have on many rural communities. My letter was responded to by Corporate Affairs at RBS, who offered an interview with someone much further down the chain of decision makers than Mr McEwen. Mr McEwen is clearly a very busy man. But then I did get an email from Mr McEwen. Unfortunately, he completely ignored my letter on behalf of elderly and vulnerable constituents and small businesses in Langham, Annan and Lockerbie. No, he completely ignored that. Instead, he was writing to me to tell me about RBS's profits for the first half of this year. Apparently, they did very well. They made £1.8 billion, and they made that money despite a fine from the US Department of Justice, he told me, of £1 billion. It seems that it's easier for the American government to hold RBS to account than our own. Mr McEwen was also very keen to tell me that as a result of these healthy profits, it made a very good start to the year, and he was pleased to announce his intention to declare a dividend of 2 pence per share, which he said was another significant moment in RBS's turnaround and a reflection of their progress. Not a single word, presiding officer, in that email about the customers, the loyal customers who have been deserted by RBS and Mr McEwen. That, to me, is not progress. Communities that I raised with him, Langham, Lockerbie and Annan, are important centres of population and economic activity, which now do not have RBS branch. And just to illustrate, the town of Langham, for example, is 30 miles from the nearest branch now, RBS in Dumfries. In March this year, I heard a day of action outside every branch that was threatened with closure, and we collected hundreds of local signatures. And some people we spoke to had been loyal to the bank for more than 50 years and felt completely let down. Many were elderly. Some did not or could not drive. They had no access to broadband, and which is, although it is improving, that doesn't mean to say everyone's going to take it up. Many older people don't have computers. They're not going to turn into silver surfers overnight. And why should they, presiding officer? Older people also expressed a preference for face-to-face branch banking because of problems with phone banking and a lack of trust in digital, which, as someone who's a victim of the latest BA hacking and had my bank card completely compromised, I have quite a lot of sympathy for. I also want to congratulate the committee on the scrutiny that they applied to the matter of consultation, which other members have raised, or perhaps lack of consultation is more appropriate, because that seems to be the case when a branch is targeted for closure. The report questions how the banks can know what customers want without consulting them. And speaking to branch staff and assessing transaction numbers does not tell the whole story. This mirrors my constituents' experience. For example, in Langham, RBS had insisted that only 20 customers are using the branch on a regular basis. But local people told me that that wasn't true, that there are always queues in the branch. Age UK points out that a lot of the numbers that are used by banks are very, very unreasonable. For example, a regular customer is considered to be someone who makes 24 visits to a branch in 26 weeks, which is almost one visit a week. And that threshold, Age UK points out, is unreasonably high. So I'm pleased that the committee concluded that the access to banking standard was failing to ensure that impact assessments properly reflect and take account of all relevant impacts in the local economy. I was pleased to see that the committee said that the standard reflected the interests of banks, not the interests of customers, and that banks should be required to consult customers, businesses and the local community in a meaningful way before deciding to close the branch. I note that the Scottish Government agrees with this particular finding of the committee. The access to banking standard is perceived and presented as a consultation when it is absolutely nothing of the kind. It's whatever the banks want it to be, and that certainly reflects the contempt that I referred to earlier with which these banks and RBS in particular hold their customers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I call Colin Smith to be followed by Alistair Allen. Mr Smith, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I also thank the members of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for their report, which highlights a number of the negative impacts bank closures are having on each and every one of the communities we represent. As we heard earlier, from 2010 to 2017, the number of bank branches in Scotland fell by a third, and that decline is continuing. There are 130 so-called cash deserts in Scotland, not just without a bank within a reasonable distance, but without access to a cash machine. Jackie Bailey very kindly told the story of when I found myself struggling to pay in a cafe recently because it had no card payment machine, no ATM nearby and no bank branch. So I was bailed out by a colleague. I'd like to tell a similar story about Jackie Bailey, but I can't remember the last time she bought me a drink. But,
outrageous.
But on a serious note, the impact of bank and ATM closures is often felt most acutely in rural areas such as the one I found myself in recently, where alternatives are few and far between, as well as in some of our most deprived communities, a point which I think was highlighted to the committee well by Keith Dryborough of Citizens Advice Scotland when he said, the most vulnerable to change are the ones who will be affected, those who are more likely to have problems accessing digital services, those who have poor broadband speeds and those in rural Scotland. The cumulative effect of closure after closure is leaving more and more of our towns and villages without a single bank branch. Let me give members just one of several examples I could choose in my own home region of Dumfries and Galloway. The town of Dalbeattie has a population of over 4,000 people. A decade ago, the town was served by 3 banks. The first to be axed was the Clydesdale Bank in 2007. This was followed by the Royal Bank of Scotland in 2014. And last year, the Bank of Scotland closed its doors for the last time in the town, leaving Dalbeattie with no bank. And it's not alone. From Whithorn in the west of the region to Lochmaber in the east, the local bank branch has become a distant memory. We're told by banks that alternatives are in place, such as mobile banking, but in the case of Dalbeattie, which I've highlighted, that consists of one bank a couple of hours per week. We're also told that the post office is an alternative, and certainly for simple bank transactions, that can be true. But for many towns and villages, that option no longer exists, with post office closures continuing in many communities. It also seems that the UK Government are doing their best to discourage the use of the post office, with the Department of Work and Pensions writing to those in receipt of a pension last month, telling them they no longer wish to pay that pension into a post office card account. And although carrying out banking transactions can be labour-intensive and time-consuming for post offices, the amounts paid for these transactions is often very poor. For example, banks charge business customers between £6 and £10 per £1,000 deposited, but only a tiny proportion of these charges filter down to the post office owner, who is paid either 24p or 37p per £1,000 deposited. That can be less than a tenner to transact £40,000, hardly an incentive for a post office to remain open to deliver services on behalf of banks. So, Presiding Officer, online banking often can be the only alternative left for communities, and yes, that is the choice of more and more people. But as Age Scotland highlights, 67% of people over the age of 75 in Scotland do not use the internet. The Federation of Small Businesses stated in their evidence to the committee that many bank closures have been in areas with lower than average broadband speeds, and which noted that poor broadband is identified as a key reason for people's decision not to use online banking services, pointing out that online banking is particularly inaccessible to those who are most financially excluded. Presiding Officer, beyond the adverse impact on individual customers, the committee's report rightly highlights the problems branch closures have posed for many charities and small businesses. The committee found that cash is essential for some businesses, and the report states that bank branch closures have impacted on productivity, which will impact on Scotland's economy. The risk posed to small businesses by these closures have been highlighted in the past by the Federation of Small Business, whose research found it often created additional costs to business owners, and they highlighted the importance of local branches in terms of cash flow and the value of face-to-face interactions. Research by the British Bankers Association also found that 68% of business customers believed that access to a local branch is important. And beyond the direct impact on businesses, the closure of banks and the resultant reduced footfall undermines our town centres, already plagued by empty buildings as more and more retailers close their doors. The problems posed by these closures are undoubtedly heightened not just by poor digital connectivity, but inadequate physical connectivity. The committee's report notes research by the Citizens Advice Bureau, which found that people living in rural areas typically had to make a 40-minute round trip to their bank using buses if they're lucky to still have a bus service. And this is before the most recent set of closures has come into force. Indeed, Keith Dryborough said to the committee that he expects travel time will increase significantly as branch closures continue. Presiding Officer, there is widespread agreement that the current decimation of local bank branches cannot be allowed to continue unchallenged, and that means we need both the Scottish and UK governments to intervene. So I echo the committee's call for the Scottish Government to call a summit with high street banks in Scotland to discuss these issues and possible solutions, including shared banking hubs. I raised the possibility of banking hubs in a recent letter to the Chief Executive of the Royal Bank of Scotland. Like Joe McAlpine, didn't get a reply from him, but one of his members of staff who dismissed it as not a sustainable solution. The truth is, it's not a case of not being able to do it. It's a case of our banks simply not wanting a more collaborative, community-focused approach to banking. And, Presiding Officer, that's just not good enough. Where is the concern for community from our banks? Why have they learned nothing about social responsibility since their financial vandalism caused the economic tsunami a decade ago? So in the absence of voluntary action from our banks, we need direct intervention. The committee rightly highlights the serious shortcomings of the access to banking standard, stating that it's failing to ensure that impact assessments properly reflect and take account of all relevant impacts on the local economy. That's why we need a mandatory consultation on bank branch closures before, not after they close. If banks won't do that properly, then we need legislation from the UK Government to ensure they do, and that's what a future Labour Government will deliver. The Scottish Government can also do more, for example, redoubling efforts to grow credit unions in our communities to make them a viable alternative, and delivering far more support for regenerating our increasingly neglected town centres to increase footfall. Presiding Officer, unless action is taken, it is only a matter of time before local bank branches disappear for good, out with only our very largest towns and cities, and that cannot be allowed to happen.
Thank you. I call Alistair Allen to be followed by Brian Whittle. Mr Allen, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank the committee for bringing such a comprehensive and helpful report to Parliament and for facilitating this debate today. As members will be aware, the decline in the number of ATMs and the decline in the number of bank branches cannot easily be separated. So I'd like to take the opportunity to speak about how both of these issues affect rural areas such as my own. Now, as the committee report acknowledges, the decline in the number of ATMs has accelerated in recent years. To some extent, this can be attributed, as other members have noted, to the decline in the use of cash. Indeed, there are some countries such as Denmark and Norway which have already floated the idea of ceasing to circulate banknotes and coins altogether. However, as other members too have noted, I think it's fair to suggest that Scotland is a long way from that situation. And for as long as that is true, we will need ATMs. The committee evidently takes that view too. Now, perhaps not for the first time, my constituency is able to provide an extreme example to illustrate a wider point. 1,200 people live on the Isle of Barra. They have one bank, the Royal Bank of Scotland, with one ATM. There is, as things stand, no other way for customers to withdraw cash outside working hours. Yet last December, RBS announced plans to close both the branch and its ATM, reassuring customers that there was another branch they could go to some 27 miles away in Loch Boisdale. What they failed to mention was that Loch Boisdale is on another island, South Uist, and that in any case RBS are cutting the hours the branch opens there too. So my constituents in Barra would face spending most of a day, if they picked the right day, by ferry and bus, just to get to the nearest bank or ATM and back. Now, while the picture has changed several times regarding the ATM, it does now look like Barra's ATM has been reprieved after much protest, but not so the bank branch itself. Already some 12,000 people, that is to say 10 times the population of Barra, have signed a petition demanding RBS reverse the decision about branch closure, recognising that this is indeed perhaps the most extreme example of RBS's callousness towards its rural customers. The Barra branch was one of 10 proposed closures across Scotland that were eventually postponed until later this year, subject to a review by the firm Johnson Carmichael. But all of that said, it cannot have escaped the notice of any community in Scotland facing such closures that the cost to the UK taxpayer of bailing out RBS was some £45.5 billion. Last week, RBS Chairman Sir Howard Davis admitted that it was unlikely that the UK government would ever be able to recoup this money. And it seems that despite all of that, RBS don't see themselves as having any responsibility to provide much of a service to these taxpayers. Conservative members may wish to use some of their famed influence with the UK government to remind them that they own some 62% of RBS shares. RBS is still effectively owned by the Conservative government. And it is difficult to square this situation with the reality outlined in the Federation of Small Businesses' written evidence to the committee that RBS alone will within the next few weeks have closed some 70% of its branches around Scotland since 2013. The Federation of Small Businesses rightly point to the impact which this will have on cash-dependent small businesses around the country. And the FSB also gave evidence indicating their fears that if the payment which Link requires card providers to pay to cash machine operators declines, then there will be even greater pressure to withdraw further free ATMs in the future. With regards to Barra, I have already submitted a response to RBS's consultation on behalf of the constituents who have contacted me on this issue. Unsurprisingly, nobody has come to me making a case for the closure to go ahead, given the alternatives, or rather the lack of them. Instead, I have heard consistently about how personal and business customers will be disadvantaged if they are left without any branch to go to at all. Many people have also mentioned the impact which a closure would have for the many tourists visiting the island, and I am sure this is true for other parts of Scotland too. Presiding Officer, the committee has provided a report which does not pull its punches on these questions, concluding that it is the most vulnerable people who will be affected most by these closures. The committee says RBS previously said that it would not shut the last branch in town. Clearly, that was a hollow promise. Presiding Officer, nowhere was that promise more obviously hollow than in the Isle of Barra. And so I call on the Royal Bank of Scotland to step in to save that branch and other branches elsewhere, which will be so much missed by the communities round about them. And I ask them to do so in their own interest to try to repair the confidence of the community in the banking service and in them.
Thank you very much. I call Brian Whittle to be followed by Fulton McGregor. Mr Whittle, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to speak in today's debate and thank the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for bringing it to the Chamber. It is one that's being considered both here and in Westminster and affects so many of our constituencies, as we've heard so much of today. In the own area, the area in which I represent, we have had recent closures in Girvan, Cumnock and Mauchline, and if you happen to be a resident of Girvan, that means you have to have a round trip either to Ayr or to Stranraer to do your banking, which is a significant journey if you have a car. But if you have to use public transport, it becomes extremely problematic. And I have to say that much like Alistair Allen's experience in Barra, the ATM in Maybole was threatened with closure. But we managed to get that decision reversed. So it is possible to have small victories as we go forward. Deputy Presiding Officer, death, taxes and change. The three inevitabilities in life, interestingly enough, all three things that we tend not to be too keen on. Change is something that we are nearly always wary of. However, with most things in life, the way we do business continues to evolve. With banks, we know that there have been some 42% decline in bank usage in Scotland since 2014. More and more customers are banking online via an app on their phones, negating the need for many over-the-counter services. With this backdrop, change is inevitable. We expect our banks to be commercial, yet we also ask that they deliver a public services, and I think sometimes those two things get in the way of each other. As I said, I think change is inevitable. But have the bank got these changes right? Obvious from today's debate, and I would also suggest they have a lot of work to do to deliver that. And in delivering change, it's important that we don't leave any section of our society behind. I think this to me, is where this debate has been focused. But some of the solutions are already out there. There has been mobile banking for some 70 years or more, so it's not a new concept. But the issues I've encountered with mobile banking in the rural areas I represent have been around timings and routes and access. But the thing is, we can actually get those changed. I didn't realise until recently that mobile banking can actually come to your home if needs be. Now, how many of our customers actually know this? Especially those with specific needs, such as those who are frail and those with disabilities that make attending a normal bank or mobile bank difficult. And I think we as MSPs and MPs as well can help to get that message out there. There are tech experts out there, there are business growth enablers, relationship managers and community bankers who, if asked, are perfectly prepared to deliver guidance on online banking. I have to say I got a tech expert to deliver a session at Age Concern meeting in Girvan. Does this solve everybody's issue? Of course it doesn't. But it goes some way to maybe to help some. And I think this is an area which, while we are holding the banks to account, we as MSPs perhaps can do a little bit more. So we are quite rightly arguing the case for our constituents and opposing closures. I think we also have that responsibility to help deliver solutions and ensure that those solutions reach those who need them. If we take the post office banking, for example, we know that the majority of personal transactions are cash transactions, which are suitable for the post office model, if the right training and delivery mechanism and services adhere to. And there's without doubt there's certainly a disparity in the delivery of that service, which again needs to be addressed. Where there's a definite need to push back is in the decline of ATMs. We need access to cash, and there has been a worrying decline in the number of free cash machines available, and it's been mentioned already today. There's 1,300 in the UK in a year have been dropped. 76 of those were in supposed protected areas. Now that cannot be allowed to continue. Link committed to maintaining the geographical spread of ATMs so that rural communities did not lose access to the cash. And as we've heard today, this is contrary to what is happening on the ground, and they actually need to be held to account on their commitment. So it's clear that the future of banking is changing. The responsibility that both banks and governments share is to make sure that change comes in a way and at a pace that leaves no one behind. And I think as MSPs we have an ability to impact this. As it stands, too many of the most vulnerable in society are falling through the cracks as banks rush to make closures. and perhaps don't put as much time and money into supporting customers for whom a branch isn't just a convenience, it's a necessity. In attending one of the committee's fact-finding meetings in Dunmellincton, which is one of the affected towns in the area I represent, it was obvious there is real concern that communities are being left behind and disadvantaged in what, as we say, is a public service. Should we expect the banks to continue delivering the same service in the same way in perpetuity, especially in the face of the speed of technological change? That would be ridiculous. However, have the banks delivered change without disadvantaging sections of our community? Again, today's debate has highlighted that they have fallen well short in this regard. But I think rather than continually just railing against banks at all these changes, I think it's important that we ensure that solutions are delivered to those who need. There are closures that absolutely should be resisted. And where closures are reluctantly needed, we must ensure that no one is left behind. We need to hold the banks to account and ensure that they deliver real solutions, and ensure that we help to disseminate that information, that no one is disadvantaged. Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call Fulton McGregor, followed by Colin Beattie. Mr Beattie will the last speaker in the open debate, so you've got your warning. Not to you, Mr McGregor. You're not warned.
Well, thank you
I
very
call
much.
Mr McGregor.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate. As now a former member of the committee, and I'd like to thank the clerks and the members for all their work during my short time on this committee. The Royal Bank of Scotland branch in Steps in my constituency was one of the 62 closed and very much fell within the last bank in town status. But it was also the last bank for neighbouring villages, the only bank available for a couple of miles for people living in Christen, Muirhead, Moodiesburn and Auchinlock. I am pleased that there was no decision to close the Coatbridge branch, but my constituents in the northern corridor area of my constituency now face having to travel not only out of their own villages or out of the boundaries of the constituency they live in, but out with the local authority area which they live. Kirkintilloch is now the closest branch for most of the people living in the north part of my constituency, and thousands are affected. And I'm sorry to say, but it is just another example of this Tory government attacking old industrial communities, perhaps made more relevant in the week we remember the 59th anniversary of the Auchingeek mining disaster in the aforementioned Moodiesburn. But it's right, Presiding Officer, that we focus on the real impact on real people. The closures of these banks has a massive impact on business, both high street and mobile. Self-employed business people who take in cash now have to travel even further to bank their takings. During the committee sessions, it was suggested that as much as 80% of retail transactions are conducted with cash. What is the solution for these business owners? For personal bank users, many people of my generation will rarely set foot inside a branch, and that is the justification given by RBS when making these decisions. But we shouldn't be focusing on the people who don't use branches. Many older people still do most of their banking in a branch. What about the lady from Christen, whose 100th birthday party I attended the other day, and the many other elderly residents in this part of the country? And let's not forget that it is older, more vulnerable people that fraudsters routinely target. It was only on Saturday past there that Monklands Police issued a serious warning that fraudsters were contacting mainly elderly folk across the area trying to scam them. Removing the ability of someone to go into a branch and speak to someone at the counter may give opportunity for these people to succeed. As has been mentioned already by various speakers, the Royal Bank of Scotland is majority owned by the state. It was taxpayers' money that bailed it out the bank when it faced collapse, and now the state does nothing but stand by and watch as they close branches all over Scotland and the rest of the UK. Commitments were always given by RBS that they would never remove the last bank in town, commitments that were completely disregarded as part of the latest round of closures, and of course the cash machines that went with it, leaving only one cash machine in Steps, and I noticed the other day that it was out of order. So for a period of time, no cash machine in that area either. However, a step I do welcome is RBS putting in place a community banker to help fill gaps and meet needs. And I have to say, Presiding Officer, I have been very impressed with this service. The community banker for Steps and surrounding areas, Lindsay Haggerty, has reached out to me and others and has been extremely flexible and responsive to suggestions and the needs of the community. For example, she has been open to having surgeries in areas where there is an unmet need. But I do feel that had there been more full consultation, or any consultation, as others have pointed out, this community banking service is something that could have been put to the communities at an earlier stage for scrutiny and consideration, And perhaps the banks would have found that if people had a say in it, it's something that they could have perhaps worked with. In addition to this, I have had various discussions with both the RBS and with the local community in Steps about the impact of the closure, and I was pleased in response to my query that the bank suggested it would be open to gifting the new derelict building to the community for the good of the village, but again, as Keith Brown had mentioned earlier, only once other options had been exhausted. This is something that we talked about in the committee at great length, and it certainly is a positive step if banks would do that. But, Presiding Officer, this is mainly a reserved matter. If this Tory government won't do its duty and use its majority shareholding to order the reversal of these closures, the very least that can be done is to make the building available to communities. And I say to the Tories in the Chamber today, what are you doing for your communities? Time after time, when the UK government fails to act in the interest of the people of Scotland, the Tory MPs and MSPs from Scottish constituencies and regions fail to act. They fail to stand up for their constituents. Each passing day gives us a clearer picture. Yes.
Rachel Hamilton.
I thank Fulton McGregor for taking an intervention. I'm not sure if Fulton McGregor realised that, but in Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire, Presiding Officer, I held a series of public meetings to engage with those people who were facing closure of their banks. I felt that as a constituency MSP, I had very much reached out. I wondered if the member had done the same.
Mr McGregor.
As I've already said to the member, I have engaged with the community in Steps about the closure of the bank, and I'm glad to hear that she's done likewise. I'd be interested to see what sort of response she got from her party colleagues in London to that intervention. But as I was saying, Presiding Officer, as each passing day gives us a clearer picture, and has always been the case, the people of Scotland simply don't matter to the Conservative Party, and the Tory parliamentarians elected in Scotland stand by and let their masters in London run roughshod over their towns and villages, despite what an individual MSP might do. Presiding Officer, throughout the time since the announcement was first made about these closures, Scottish Government ministers have made it clear their willingness to work with the UK counterparts to do what is right. This has been continually ignored by the UK Government, as tends to be the case these days in a number of issues. Presiding Officer, in finishing, I make a final plea on behalf of my constituents to the UK Government and to the party's representatives here today. Act and act now. Work with the Scottish Government to help the communities devastated by these closures and prevent any further. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr McGregor. I now call Colin Beattie, then we'll move to closing speeches. Mr Beattie, please.
Presiding Officer, as a member of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee, I am pleased to have the opportunity to speak in today's debate. Research by the Federation of Small Businesses shows that bank branches are closing at a faster rate in Scotland than in any other UK nation. As a result, no fewer than 1 in 2 businesses have experienced bank closures. Evidence taken by the committee suggests that there are indications to show that bank closures directly impact on the health of the local economy and on the establishment and growth of local businesses. Banks have not been particularly honest in their engagement on this subject. For example, RBS stated that they would never close the last bank in town, and yet that's exactly what they've done. Figures quoted in 2016 suggest this has happened 165 times in Scotland and the north of England. In communities such as Kilmalcolm, Gourock, Preston Pans, and more locally Newton Grange, and also in Pathhead in my own constituency of Midlothian North and Musselburgh. Earlier this year, RBS closed their branch in Bonnyrigg in my constituency. The inconvenience to local businesses and to personal customers, many of whom are vulnerable and elderly, was considerable. Bank closures continue the pernicious hollowing out of our communities, as libraries and other local facilities, which form the heart of these communities, are either closed or run down. It's increasingly important to retain bank branches, which are so important to the health and wealth of our local communities. It's not just inconvenience, it's an attack on the sustainability of our smaller towns and villages. When the RBS announcement was made, I met with representatives from RBS to express my concern and disappointment that this decision to close the Bonnyrigg branch had been taken with so little real consultation. RBS took the view that more and more customers banking online and by phone, overall branch usage reducing by 44% since 2012, and around 29 million log-ons every month to the mobile app was the justification for such a large branch network being hard to support. In the Bonnyrigg branch, transactions had dropped by 20% since 2012, and 80% of customers were using alternative access to banking. RBS assured me that vulnerable customers were being contacted to explain their options. A fine story was told of how RBS were providing experts
to train people to use online or other digital means of accessing their accounts. Business clients were also contacted to explain the most appropriate ways for their business support to continue. By the time RBS had described to me the wonderful support and services that would be available to their customers after the branch closure, I wondered why any branches at all were kept open. So perfect were the arrangements being put in place. Unfortunately, the reality is that service and support would be significantly reduced, especially after the initial period after closure. Customers were directed to the local post office, where long-term arrangements had been made to accommodate both business and personal customers. But a post office simply does not have the capacity or the will to replace a bank. They are, quite frankly, different businesses. A post office can handle basic transactions if they're low volume and within very tight parameters. Bonnyrigg is one of the largest towns in my constituency, containing a large number of small businesses whose turnover is mostly in cash. They need to be able to bank these takings, but without a local bank or adequate arrangements through the post office, the businessman either needs to take time out of his day to travel to the nearest bank branch or pay for the money to be uplifted. Now, I understand the pure logic of why, as a business, RBS decided to close this branch, given reduced customer footfall and the rise of electronic banking. However, I took the opportunity to point out that banks need to look at a much wider picture than short-term profit enhancement. They also have a social responsibility to the local community and to the development of the environment in which we live and work. Banks should be part of this, and if they fail to be so, then alternative structures will gradually come into being, which will result in their exclusion and isolation from the communities in which they previously played such an important role. This cannot be to the bank's long-term viability. Banks must be relevant or they will cease to be part of our communities and may well be overtaken and vanish. RBS made much of arrangements with the local post office to allow personal customers to withdraw and deposit cash, deposit cheques, and allow business customers to register to obtain coinage and to deposit cash. And yet earlier this month, only a few months after RBS closed its doors, it was announced that Bonnyrigg Post Office would be closing at the end of this month. And while the Post Office is actively looking for another location within the town, progress is slow. I think that perhaps RBS, who's supposedly been putting alternative banking arrangements in place, have faced residents with considerable inconvenience who will have to use branches located some distance away, and for the elderly or disabled, this will prove difficult. While there has been scrutiny of the impact bank closures have on businesses and the wider community, the impact closures have on the ATM network receives less attention. This is despite the fact that many ATMs in Scotland are located in or nearby bank branches and have been cited by banks as the replacement for lost branches. ATMs have the potential to offset some of the problems experienced by bank closures. Access to banking and financial inclusion are two basic requirements of any functioning economy and should be recognised by all who seek to sell products and services to small businesses. Typically, small business banking services involve managing cash flow, checking account balances, but they might also include more complicated issues such as applying for a business loan. Without a local branch to visit to discuss options, businesses are left with very few options for guidance and advice. Finally, with services all across Scotland being cut, and towns such as Bonnyrigg losing out on vital services like banks and post offices, you have to ask yourself how people are supposed to go about their daily life without access to money. And while I recognise people have debit and credit cards, or even access to contactless payments if it's under £30, many vulnerable people do not feel safe using these methods and prefer to have access to money in their purse or wallet. Local businesses rely on the support from bank branches, and when a branch does close, the impact on these businesses could be vital to the future of the small businesses. Banks need to revisit their assumptions and engage with that bigger picture, while the Scottish Government must have a role in that engagement.
Thank you. Closing speeches. I can give all the closing speakers an extra minute. I know you'll have no difficulty fulfilling it. So I call Lewis MacDonald close for Labour. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Today's debate has reminded us once again of the gulf between what communities expect from their high street banks and what those banks actually think they are obliged to do. Banking is indeed, as has been said, a public service provided by private businesses. But of course that does not tell the whole story. Rarely has any sector of private business owed its very survival to such a large scale of public intervention. And while closing local branches may represent a different scale of impact from the casino banking which brought the global economy so close to catastrophe a decade ago. The sweeping closures we've seen in Scotland and across the UK in recent years suggest that bank executives still pay scant regard to the communities which provide their profits and whose need for financial services they are supposed to meet. In my own region, we have seen round after round of closures, most recently, but not exclusively, by the Royal Bank of Scotland. The list of RBS closures reads like a travel guide to the North East. Banff and Turriff and Huntly and Ellen and Montrose this year, West Hill and Bankery and Stonehaven last year, and as Mike Rumbles reminded us, Afford and other local branches before that. In Aberdeen City, suburban communities like Dice and Bridge of Dawn have also lost their local branch, and of course many local jobs have gone as a result. So I joined with members of the Bank Workers Union Unite earlier this year in a protest at the Bridge of Dawn RBS against that closure and against the wider closure programme as a whole. Sadly, though, as we have heard today, the best efforts of staff, trade unions, customers and parliamentary committees have so far failed to halt the industry's drive to withdraw from most of Scotland's high streets. Of course, it's true, as the banking industry are keen to tell us, that not everyone values a local branch. Many customers do choose to do their financial transactions online or through a mobile phone, and those choices are certainly beneficial from the point of view of the bank's bottom line. But the key word here is choices, and what branch closures do is to deny choice to those customers who prefer to bank in person in their local community. As we have heard this afternoon, the customers who are least interested in online or mobile banking and choose to use a local bank are often older people and more vulnerable people. 20% of people in Scotland today are not online at home, and it is those people who have the most to lose from the kind of closure programme we have seen. And it is often, as Age Scotland have strongly pointed out, it is often the very same people who are socially isolated in other ways for whom doing business at their local bank or post office or shop is important, not just in itself, but as part of what keeps them in touch with their local community and gets them out of the house to have that social engagement which is so vital for their health and well-being. And we've also heard this afternoon a number of contributions about the importance of local bank facilities for local businesses. The ability to deposit takings and to access cash are vital to the day-to-day running of many small firms. Again, some small businesses are very comfortable, very happy doing much of their work online, but many do not. Many don't have that choice given the nature of their business. And again, what matters here is that businesses should have a choice about where to do their banking and be able to do what suits them best. Instead, we have a blanket approach by banks, and we've seen evidence in the committee's report, and we've heard again some reference to this today. Banks which want to speed up the shift from face-to-face banking to online transactions, as if they want to make online transactions the standard way or indeed the only way of accessing cash and services, rather than one of several options open to their customers. And too many rural areas particularly find themselves in the position where those choices have been taken away. So this debate is about access for individual customers, especially older and more vulnerable people. It is also about access for businesses, in particular local small firms which rely on cash transactions with local customers. It's also about the health and well-being of local communities themselves. There seems still to be little willingness on the part of the banking industry to accept a collective responsibility for ensuring continued access to face-to-face banking for those who choose that in local communities. And that, I think, is what needs to change. Banks compete with each other, of course, as well as with alternative providers of financial services. So it might seem counterintuitive for them to cooperate to provide all their customers with choice about how they access banking service. But that actually is what needs to happen. And among several very good recommendations in this report, the one I would highlight is the one which calls on the Scottish Government to call a summit to get banks to work together to provide access to shared services, for example, through a shared banking hub in a community. And I hope ministers will agree to do that, of course.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way and his emphasis on the banks working together. I mean, doesn't he think with me that the link system, where the banks do work together and you can basically get your cash out of almost any machine, shows that they can work together if it suits them?
Lewis MacDonald.
John Mason is absolutely right. The link system is a critical way in which banks combine to provide a service. There, of course, is a commercial aspect to that, and we've heard that there has been serious concern about that in the recent past. But the point about putting pressure on the link system in order to provide or maintain that access to cash machines is one that can certainly be replicated for banks and branches themselves. Why not have banks work together? If a community, whether it's Castlebay and Barra, whether it's Afford and Aberdeenshire, whatever it is, if a community can have access to the services of several different banks through a hub operated by one of them, that clearly is a better solution for everybody than to get a position where bank after bank after bank closes. And as Colin Smith said in his example, you go in a very short time from having 3 bank branches in a village or town to having none at all. So I think that's an area where there is action that can be taken. We've heard also about strengthening the access standard, which we support, and about improving delivery of such banking services by post offices, credit unions and mobile banking vans, which would also be welcome in as far as that can be done. But ensuring that engaging banks in the delivery of shared services is something which Scottish ministers can do without waiting for action elsewhere, and I hope that will now follow. Paul Wheelhouse reported to Parliament a year ago that there was a recognition among members of the Scottish Government's Financial Services Advisory Board that consideration of the impact of closures was now necessary. We now need to see banks act on that recognition. If they do not, the case for changing the law will only get stronger. If the only way to protect choice for customers is to put new legal obligations on banks in relation to public access in communities, then we believe that is what should happen. And as my colleagues have already said, a good start would be to require banks to consult local communities and businesses before a decision to close is made, not after. And that is a change which should be required by law and build on this committee's report.
Thank you very much. I call on Jamie Halker-Johnson to close for the Conservatives. 7 minutes, please, Mr Halker-Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I briefly apologise to the Minister and to colleague Dean Lockhart for leaving the chamber briefly during their speech. I would like to join previous speakers in expressing my gratitude to those of my fellow members of the committee, as well as the clerking team for all their support during the course of our inquiry. And I'd also like to thank the organisations that came to the Scottish Parliament to give evidence, and those organisations and individuals that submitted written evidence to support the committee's work. Today's speeches have told us much about the local impact of national decisions on bank closures. Often the communities most affected by local branch closures are those in remote and rural areas, of which, of course, there are many in my region, the Highlands and Islands. And it was also significant that we've looked not just at the most recent round of bank closures, but the longer-term decline in branch numbers and other services as a backdrop for these changes. It was important, however, that this inquiry provided a Scotland-wide picture, addressing how different communities interact with banking services. And the social impact of closures, as well as the effects of financial exclusion amongst certain groups, was rightly a major consideration of the committee's work. While accessibility via online and telephone banking has for some made banking more accessible, it's equally true to say that the move away from face-to-face banking services has created barriers for others. We also explored the impact on business and the effect not only on the different sectors and businesses of different sizes, but also on businesses located in different geographical areas. With connectivity still a challenge in many parts of my region, many of the most obvious electronic solutions are untenable. Our conclusion relating to the needs of Highlands and Islands the need for Highlands and Islands enterprise and Scottish enterprise, as well as the banks themselves, to work with these businesses is significant, and one that I would underline. Equally, we've heard evidence from community and voluntary groups, such as the U3A Murray Coast in my region, who spoke of the challenges for voluntary organisations of regularly changing signatories on accounts and other administrative tasks without easy access to a local branch. And as the inquiry progressed, we also had the opportunity to hear from a number of banks about the work they are undertaking to create modern banking services. Much of this is praiseworthy. From paying in cheques electronically to cash uplift services, there clearly has been a considerable amount done in recent years to improve access. It is, however, worth noting that, despite these approaches, a range of concerns were heard by the committee and are recognised in our report. It's clear that there is a trade-off here. With more accessible electronic banking, footfall in branches has clearly declined. There are a number of areas for development beyond this report. We were candid in the need for additional information to build a comprehensive picture of the impact of closures across Scotland and across the UK more widely. And this should include what provision can be made for access and the role of Scotland's two governments in supporting solutions to the problems that we've heard. Equally, our remit did not include the perhaps difficult task of exploring the future of banking in this country. There are clearly a number of concerns that technological progress has raised, and we've yet to see serious discussion, for example, the wider opportunities and problems created by an increasingly cashless society. Presiding Officer, there have been a number of positive and insightful contributions from around the Chamber today. Our convener and my parliamentary colleague, Gordon Lyndhurst, speaking on behalf of the committee, summarised the findings of our inquiry well and set out a number of the recommendations we have made as future steps forward. I would hope that these recommendations were welcomed by the Minister and that there will be an opportunity to progress on them. Dean Lockhart discussed the related issue of ATMs. The committee recognised that these devices, particularly free-to-use ATMs, are an important means of accessing cash in many areas across Scotland and many areas of my region of the Highlands and Islands. As a committee, we did recognise the current controversy around charging by the linked network and heard some evidence of this area. Members will also be familiar that similar issues have been explored by the Scottish Affairs Select Committee at the UK Parliament through a dedicated ATM network inquiry earlier this year. We also considered the limitations of ATMs, which, as Link explained, were targeted at individuals rather than at businesses. Edward Mountain rightly talked about the impact on our region, the Highlands and Islands, and highlighted that banks should, of course, have been consulting before closure, something I think Stuart McMillan mentioned as well, and others. And the issues, of course, with accessibility for some of our disabled constituents. Rachel Hamilton also spoke about the lack of consultation and further on the issue of ATM closures, which again are particularly pertinent in places like the borders. She also spoke of access via the mobile banking vans, which have become such a common feature of many rural communities, and of course of their drawbacks. The Post Office's capacity to provide a full alternative for face-to-face banking services was also mentioned, which is something that the committee considered and heard a range of views on. Brian Whittle spoke about the need to help those most affected by bank closures to access the new services available, to which might help mitigate some of the closures themselves. Looking at other contributions, the Minister talked about the strength of feeling and the impact on rural communities, and as a Highland MSP, she'll know, as well as all of us that live in rural remote communities, that how much that can affect. Jackie Bailey talked about her disappointment with her own bank, and I'm sure she echoes the opinions of hundreds of thousands of people, and many of us across Scotland, who have been left with a bank further away than they started. And we also learnt that Colin Smith doesn't buy around, and that was later confirmed by him. Well, you can fight it out between yourselves. Mike Rumbles also talked about his own experiences, and also Colin Smith highlighted the issues of both digital and physical connectivity and how important they are. And Alistair Allen talked about an issue about issues about accessing banking and the difficulties in the islands community. And again, that is something that I'm very aware of, and it's very extremely important. Overall, it's been a very constructive debate and one that highlights a number of the issues that the committee raised. And in closing, I would like to again thank my fellow committee members, those that are still on the committee and have moved on to other responsibilities, and also the clerking team for their excellent work that they've done over the period of the inquiry. And I hope that the positives that have come up in this committee can be taken forward and acted on.
Thank you very much. I now call on the Minister, Kate Forbes.
Officer, I again start by commending the committee's work to raise the issue of bank branch closures supported by many in the chamber here today. And I welcome the constructive nature of the report, which looked at both the problem and suggested solutions to it. It's critically important that we continue to speak up for constituents and communities who can feel powerless in the wake of bank closures. And although banking remains reserved, the Scottish Government has a responsibility to ensure that the voices of customers, small businesses and communities are heard at the highest level. And that is a responsibility that we've taken seriously over the last few months, particularly in the wake of the particularly damaging branch closures or RBS branch closures. So I wanted to pick up on a few themes that we've heard here today. And the first point to pick up on is the vulnerable people who are hit hardest by these branch closures. Gillian Martin talked about the human cost and the importance of social inclusion when it comes to looking at branch closures. And Jackie Bailey highlighted the loyalty of customers, customers who are taken for granted by banks because we are less likely to switch banks. And it's older, more vulnerable people in particular who are hit by these branch closures, but not only them. It hits the retail sector in particular, who are still highly dependent on cash, and it hits ordinary people who suffer the loss and feel that banks are not accountable for the actions that they take. Rachel Hamilton talked about the importance of ensuring that there are alternatives before closing a branch and spoke about taking a gamble on the post office. She also highlighted the powerful story of a gentleman in Eyemouth who was caught out waiting for a mobile branch in particularly awful weather. And the question there about the dignity of customers who are dependent on branches and that face-to-face contact. And Fulton McGregor also talked about the lady from Christon who celebrated 100 years, and I saw the picture on Twitter. But again, these people feel like they're being left behind, and it's important that we not only talk about profits when it comes to these branch closures, but also talk about the social needs of customers who feel abandoned. The second theme was around rural areas, and I can certainly empathise because as a Highland MSP, I've seen branch closures in my own constituency as well, in Mallig, Bewley, Kyle and Aviemore. And in some cases, particularly the one in Bewley, it was the last bank in town. Now, that is one of the 10 branches that have potentially been reprieved, but it awaits to be seen with the outcome of the independent review. And when it comes to rurality, there are significant distances to travel. There was mention of the average of 40 minutes of travel in rural areas, but that is an average, and for some it can be in the region of hours, and as Alistair Allen said, for others it can be an entire day, depending on ferries there and ferries back to get to South Uist. And if you are taking most of a day to get to your nearest branch, that has obvious implications on work, on business and on other opportunities, whether that's education or training. The third theme was around cash, which is still essential in so many sectors and in so many parts of the country. And Dean Lockhart emphasised the importance of the network of ATMs and the importance of cash in our society. The access to cash and the ability to deposit cash was identified by the committee as a key issue, particularly for small businesses. And it's clear that there will be a continuing long-term need for access to cash banking services in Scotland. The Scottish Government has raised issues on ATM coverage with Link and the payment system regulator and will continue to do so. And as Link's changes to the network take effect, the impact on the network will become apparent. Now, the PSR has announced that it will take regulatory action requiring Link to set out explicitly how it will maintain the broad geographic spread of free-to-use ATMs across the UK, and that is vitally important. Keith Brown mentioned the promise that was made about not leaving if RBS were the last bank in town. And as I've already highlighted from my own constituency example, that has not happened. There are cash deserts, as Colin Smith has highlighted, where people have no cash access. And they are caught out. Whilst it was an amusing story in terms of being caught out with only a card, it can be far more serious when it's more than just a coffee that you're trying to pay for, or when banks, or rather businesses, find themselves without cash and in need of cash. And as the FSB highlighted, And that's particularly difficult in areas which have lower than average broadband services. So if it's a choice of paying somebody over broadband, which you don't have access to, or cash, you end up with a higher number of people and businesses who become financially excluded. Collaboration is key. Collaboration, particularly that highlighted in the discussion between Lewis MacDonald and John Mason. There are other examples where banks work together, and there is no reason, albeit with the commercial sensitivities, that they can't work together better on other initiatives, whether that is hubs, whether that's open banking, whether that is ensuring that customers ultimately have access. Brian Whittle. Yeah.
Mike Rumbles.
Could you tell me, genuine question, is it, we've heard from some of the banks, or certainly I have, that they can't do the hub idea because of regulatory restrictions, and now we know that's reserved for the UK government. Is it actually the case that that is true, or could they, on a voluntary nature, engage in hubs in communities? I'd like genuinely to know the answer to that.
Minister.
Well, and I will answer in the spirit that the question was asked, which is, I think to make any of those initiatives work, when it comes to collaboration, regulators have to be involved, and it needs to be a conversation not just between the banks and not just between government and banks, but also get the regulator involved as well, because I think regulation needs to be updated as well to recognise the changing needs of customers. Now, there are models that work, like the link system, like talking about open banking, and when it comes to the hub system, there will need to be considerations when it comes to the regulator for what works and what doesn't work. But I don't think that means that we throw out the whole concept of banks sharing in an effort to meet the customer needs. So it's not just rural communities either. There are, for example, Bonnyrigg as Colin Beattie mentioned, it's not just rural areas where people need to travel further, and I find that a big disadvantage, particularly when they're dependent on public transport. And the last point before I close is on consultation. There's been a lot of comment around what real consultation looks like. Stuart McMillan asked that question. Joan McAlpine talked about the fact that it's too little too late to be having discussions once communities have already taken the brunt of the closure. And that communication needs to be effective with communities and also with representatives who often have to answer constituents at surgeries who are deeply concerned about the future of banking provision. So I think there's a sense across the chamber of unanimity, of consensus, that the need for physical face-to-face banking services and access to cash remains there. There's a need there. Customers deserve choice, and there needs to be solutions for all customers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can I now ask John Mason to wind up on behalf of the committee?
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer, till 5 o'clock, I assume. So on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee, and I do congratulate Colin Smith and Brian Whittle, who both got the title right. I think other people were perhaps confused by the fact the report actually says Economy, Jobs and Fair Work Committee, but we do now have a new name. So many thanks to everyone who's contributed to the debate today, the 19 speeches from the 18 speakers. I find it encouraging that Parliament is as interested as they are in our looking at this subject of bank closures. So first of all, I'll touch on some key issues as I see them, and I hope as the committee has seen them, and then maybe, if I've got time, go on to some of the individual contributions we've had. As others have said, online and phone banking are all very well, but cash is still needed, and that is stressed in paragraph 19 of our recommendations. Banks are there to serve the public, not just to drive change. Banks are not just an optional extra like a sweetie shop or the bookies. They are a public service, and a number of members have mentioned that public service, like Brian Whittle and others, and there is a tension because they're private businesses, but as others have said, they are private businesses that would not exist if the public sector had not bailed them out. A real theme has been the lack of consultation with customers, and Kate Forbes mentioned that, Edward Mountain, Gillian Martin, Stuart McMillan, but then others did as well, and I stopped writing down the notes. And I personally remain unconvinced that this could not happen. I think that's true of the committee as well. It happens in other sectors that there is consultation before a final decision is made, and I believe it could happen in this, which is a public service, even run by the private sector. Now, when we come to the Post Office as an alternative, I personally am very positive, and paragraphs 23 to 26 look at this. I think this is one of the best options going forward, given that we cannot recreate the bank network that we had in the past. I was interested in the Post Office response, which accepts that there is a lack of awareness and that only 40% of the public realise that they could use the Post Office for banking services. I think that was true for the committee, that we hadn't realised how much could be done at Post Office, and I think there definitely needs to be an increase in that awareness, and I welcome the fact that the Post Office are committing to do an awareness-raising campaign starting, I believe, on the 1st of October. I was on one of the groups that went out to visit Leven along with Colin Beattie, and that was where we were shown a letter from, I believe it was the Royal Bank of Scotland, who were closing their branch in that town, and they only suggested other Royal Banks, and other members have suggested how far away these might be. They did not in the letter, as far as I could see, mention the Post Office at all. So there is clearly something very far wrong if we are hoping that the Post Office is the way forward, and the banks will not even tell their own customers that that is an option, and I expect them to go 20 miles an hour, whatever it is, to get to another branch of that bank. So I'm encouraged by parts of the response that we had from the Post Office, and especially on awareness raising. However, I was less happy with what they said about security in their letter. I'm not sure if all members have seen this letter. It was addressed to the convener of the committee. But I, for one, have to say that I feel less comfortable going into a totally open plan supermarket or whatever, where the Post Office is at one of the tills, and we are expected to carry out normal banking services. Now, there are still some post offices. I was at one in Portsmouth in the summer, where there is a separate place that you go to and do your post office or banking transactions. And I think a lot of people would be comfortable with that. But the Post Office even criticised the committee for raising this issue. They suggest that we are that making this claim publicly is an open invitation to the criminal world and threatens the safety of our staff and customers. I mean, how ridiculous is that to get this kind of response from what is meant to be a national organisation, the Post Office? So there is a real concern. Many people are really concerned. And I've also heard from local post office owners in my constituency about the tensions they have with the Post Office as a whole. And I think it was Colin Smith, or no, it was Lewis MacDonald, was it, who mentioned the different rates that are paid to the Post Office as a whole, but how little of that works its way through to the post master or mistress, if that's the correct term. Rachel Hamilton, Colin Smith both spent quite a lot of time talking about the post offices, and I think that we had a bit of an interchange around that. The only bank that actually contacted me over the summer after the report was published was Lloyds Bank of Scotland, and I agreed to meet them, and they were stressing the option of people collecting, people having their money collected, businesses, by the bank's collection service. I think that is an option. I think it's something maybe we didn't look at a lot in the report, but clearly some businesses do not really feel that that is an option. The Treasury response was also a bit of a mixture of positive and negative. Positively, the payment system regulator and the impact on Link, and others have mentioned that some of the reductions in charges will not be happening. That is positive and shows that basically the UK government can have an impact on the banking sector in that regard. But more negatively, in relation to the access to banking standard, they say that, quote, they think it is, quote, working effectively at present, unquote. Well, I think the committee was pretty well unanimous in saying that that is not the case. It is not working effectively, and it needs to be on a statutory basis. Others have mentioned Link and the ATMs, and we are also concerned, obviously, about losing some of these. But more positively, as I was intervened on Lewis MacDonald, it is an example of banks working together and seems to me to show that it could be done and that community hubs or joint branches are a possibility. And the fact that we can almost all get money out of any machine is very positive. Just if I can mention my own constituency in passing, we had an RBS in Shettleston, and it was very busy. I used it often myself. As Jackie Bailey said, there was often a queue there, and yet they announced that it was going to be closed. And I have to say I was so incensed at that time that I did something that I don't think I've ever done before, which was to work with the local Labour Party, and specifically with Margaret Curran and Frank McAveety. And we did a joint campaign, led by a community council, I should say, on that point, although we didn't have a lot of success. Now, just to go on to one or two of the comments that were made, I'm not going to have time for everybody. Obviously, the convener, Gordon Lyndhurst, made a lot of good points. He made a biblical reference, and I was just wondering how I could respond to that. So there is, of course, the example in the Bible of Jesus turning over the tables of the money changers. So I thought perhaps he and I could go on a tour of Edinburgh tomorrow and turn over a few tables. A number of others. Kate Forbes made the interesting point that digital progress should mean things are more inclusive, and others made the point that there should be more choice rather than less choice, which I would totally agree with. One I definitely wanted to touch on was Mike Rumble's suggestion that a Scottish Parliament committee should do a joint inquiry with a Westminster committee. Well, I'm not sure if that has happened. I'm certainly open to the idea of it, although I think there are some practical problems and challenges with that. I think there's also the problem that we have to get the Westminster folk not to look down on us and treat us as equals. And I have to say, having been there, I do think MPs have a lot more time in their hands than MSPs have. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'm delighted that our inquiry has generated this level of interest. Again, many thanks to the witnesses, the speakers and everyone who's taken part. And I think I can say on behalf of the committee, we will not be forgetting about this topic. We will be keeping an eye on how things develop, and we may well be back to challenge the different players in due course. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our debate on bank closures on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 13984 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a revised business programme for Thursday. And could I ask any member, if they wish to speak against this motion, to press their request to speak button now? Could I call on Graham Day to move the motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no one seems to object. Therefore, the question is that motion 13984 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The next item of business is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau motion 13973 on approval of an SSI. Could I ask Graham Day again on behalf of the Bureau to move the motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. We turn now to decision time. The first question is that motion 13912 in the name of Gordon Lyndhurst on bank closures, impact on local businesses, consumers and the Scottish economy be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The final question is that motion 13973 in the name of Graham Day on approval of an SSI be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And that concludes decision time. We'll move now to members' business in the name of Bill Kidd on UN International Day of Peace 2018, but we'll just take a few moments for members and ministers to change seats.
Thank you. The next item of business and the final item of business is a members' business debate on motion 13646 in the name of Bill Kidd on UN International Day of Peace 2018. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? and I call on Bill Kidd to open the debate. Mr Kidd, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It helps if I speak into the microphone. Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would first of all like to thank all of the colleagues here in the Chamber who have stayed back, but particularly those who actually signed and supported the motion that I am now bringing forward for debate. And this recognises International Day of Peace 2018. Every year this is celebrated on the 21st of September, and this year it falls on Friday of this week. I also want to welcome to the Chamber members of the International Voluntary Service who are working to raise the profile of this day in Scotland, and such promotions contributed to this debate taking place. I would like, on top of that, to thank and welcome to the Chamber members of organisations which comprise the cross-party group on nuclear disarmament. As we recognise this auspicious day, I would like to use this debate to explain what international peace looks like in practice and why, as politicians, we have the capacity, mechanisms and responsibility to promote the UN International Day of Peace. So what does international peace actually look like? Does it mean no wars and no conflict? Well, ideally, yes, it does. But peace is a more useful concept when you use it as a goal for something complex and difficult, not impossible to achieve. In international relations, the most prominent understanding of peace, seminally put forward by Johan Galtung in 1969, explained that peace relies on our capacity to create peace, or alternatively, our capacity to stop violence. Terming peace in this way stops it being an unattainable thing. It makes peace both real and tangible. It's something that we can make a solid contribution towards. Peace is the absence of violence. We are lucky enough these days to live in times of peace here in Scotland. The normal experience of Scottish people nowadays is very different to what people had to live through and die for during large parts of the 20th century. Most notable is the sacrifice, of course, made in World War I and World War II. And Global Peace Day is an opportunity to recognise the contribution of all those who fought to provide peace for their children and grandchildren, the heavy and moving sacrifice of which we live in today. The creation of a peaceful society for us to live in also allows for us to consider a second layer to peace. This is a type of peace which involves the reduction of structural violence, or social inequality, as it is better known these days. One of the biggest movements towards reducing social inequality on an international scale is the United Nations Global Goals. These goals provide action points for countries to tackle worldwide issues, such as hunger and poverty. They also provide direction on how to promote quality education, renewable energy, innovation, infrastructure, climate change, justice and human rights. This again roots back to the key point about our ability to reduce inequality. Structural violence or inequality, which the global goals work against, happens when a person's well-being, either mental or physical, is reduced below where it could and should reasonably be. Before institutions like the United Nations, it would have been difficult to make an international effort to reduce hunger, but now we have a greater ability to do so. And a good example for explaining capacity to reduce violence or social inequality would be if someone had an illness like cholera in the Victorian era and died from dehydration. At that time, the medical profession did not know what cholera was or how to remedy it. They didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the ability to help that person. However, if someone today loses their life to an easily preventable and remedied illness such as cholera, then we could say that violence has been committed on that person. If we have the capacity to reduce inequality, then we must strive to find ways to do this. Today, this could involve a fair distribution of medical supplies and access to doctors, which the NHS is a fantastic example of. If we have the ability to actively promote peace and the capacity to make a change, then we have the responsibility to do so. As parliamentarians, we here are privileged to be in a position to affect legislation working towards peace, whether it be on climate justice by voting in the climate change bill, or voting in the Child Poverty Act, we have the ability to be ambitious in promoting peace. As mentioned, the United Nations increases our ability to promote peace as it provides the opportunity for collaboration. In 2001, the General Assembly of the United Nations voted to mark the International Day of Peace as a day of non-violence and ceasefire. And since this has come into being, it has been allowing the delivery of aid to vulnerable groups within conflict zones. An incredible example of this is how the organisation of Peace One Day has worked with UNICEF and the World Health Organization for the immunisation of 1.4 million children against polio in insecure southern and eastern regions of Afghanistan. The Global Peace Day ceasefire has seen the Taliban put down arms recurrently since 2007 to allow safe passage for aid workers. It's clear that in many cases we do have the ability to make a difference. For me personally, this means working towards nuclear disarmament. I want to see weapons which indiscriminately kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people abolished. If you are undecided about nuclear weapons, then please use this Peace Day to look at the work of ICANN, PNND or Scottish CND for further explanation of the humanitarian impact of these weapons. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had survivors, but they were not physically recognisable to their loved ones after the bombings. That cannot be allowed to happen again. As many of you know, ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize last year for their work in bringing about the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The next major step for nuclear disarmament will be the UN high-level conference, which I will be attending, and where we will count out $1 trillion, which is the amount of money wasted on nuclear weapons every year around the world. Whether it is this or another matter of importance, I compel you. Where you have the ability to promote peace, do so. It can be complex, it can be difficult, but it cannot and is not impossible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kidd. Open debate. Linda Fabiani, followed by Alexandra Stewart. Ms Fabiani, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank you, Bill, for the persistence that Bill Kidd has, Presiding Officer, in bringing such issues to our Parliament on a regular basis. I very much wanted just to contribute today mainly to celebrate the volunteers who do so much fantastic work worldwide in the name of peace, and Bill Kidd outlined some of the work that's done there. And so many people look at the declarations of the UN, the different days we have, and somehow think that it's not that important, but it's truly important because it brings so many people together and it brings the issues together and puts them at the forefront. And when you look closely at the different declarations that are made by the UN, by nations coming together, whether it be the global goals, whether it be the declarations Bill has talked about today, they tie in together in a way of trying to create a big picture of citizens coming together and saying, this is not right and we have to work to make our world a better place. And there was another declaration made by the UN some 50 years after the human rights one, which was the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. I think that's also a very, very important one because human rights defenders are other volunteers who go out there to make sure that that structural peace can be maintained by human rights workers being defended. And Peace Brigades International, I should probably declare an interest in that. I've been a member of the organisation for many years, not to the degree that others are in the work that they do, though I hope perhaps someday I might be able to help more than I do at the moment. But Peace Brigades International, they do fantastic work. And that's why I put down a motion myself about that, and thank you to those who signed it. Peace Brigades International currently work in 7 countries. They're working in Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, Kenya, Indonesia and Mexico. They're working in countries where communities experience violent conflict. And as was outlined by Bill Kidd in his motion and in the work that he does, it can be conflict within a nation as well as conflict amongst nations. It's about repression, internal oppression, as well as external aggression. And the philosophy of Peace Brigades International is that lasting transformation of conflicts cannot come from the outside, but it must be based on the capacities and desires of local people. So you have volunteers promoting peace, whether it be the International Voluntary Service, so many different strands of that, whether it be organisations that are very specific, like Peace Brigades International, actually showing on the ground that a different way is useful. The work with trained volunteers involves physical accompaniment, capacity development workshops, advocacy tours, and raising concerns for human rights defenders. And that's another way that people that work in this field come together. All these different organisations come together, truly believe in peace and in promoting peace, and the responsibility of those of us who are fortunate enough to live in a peaceful society to try and spread some of that peace to others. I could go on a long time about this, Presiding Officer, but I'm looking at the time. And so all I would like to say is thank you very, very much to the International Voluntary Service in promoting Peace Day 2018 here in Scotland. Thank you to all those who do more than just pay money to Peace Brigades International, but actually go out and do the hard work on the ground. And I would urge those who don't know an awful lot about these organisations to look into them deeper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Abiani. I call Alexander Stewart, to be followed by Claudia Beamish. Mr Stewart, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Delighted to be able to take part today, and I congratulate and commend Bill Kidd for securing this debate this afternoon. Each year, the International Day of Peace is observed around the world on the 21st of September, as you already heard, and the UN General Assembly has declared that this day is devoted to strengthening the ideas of peace both within and among the nations and its peoples. So giving peace a chance, and I think that's what we need to ensure we do. Back in 2015, the United Nations member states adopted the ideas of 17 Sustainable Development Goals as they understood it, and it would not be possible to build a peaceful world without steps to achieve economic and social development from everyone and to ensure that their rights were protected. It's vitally important that their rights are protected. These sustainable goals covered a broad range of ideas, including poverty, hunger, health, education, climate change, gender equality, water, energy, environment and social justice. And each and every one of them play a part to ensure that we can achieve the goals that they set. They are the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for us all, a peaceful future for us all. The goals address the global challenges that we face, including these related to inequality, climate and environment, and justice, peace in itself. The goals are in order to ensure that we all have a responsibility, and these should be achieved by 2030. Deputy Presiding Officer, the theme for International Day of Peace 2018 is the right to peace, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 70. And we thank all of those who have played a part. We've heard already about World War I, and we're going to be commemorating some anniversaries as we go forward. And what happened in World War II. These individuals gave of their time, their talent and their lives to secure peace for all of us. And that's vitally important that we remember them. The theme of the celebrations talks about the human rights, and that whole idea is a milestone to discover, and we should ensure these human rights. Drafted from responsibilities with different legal and cultural backgrounds from all regions of the world, it's vitally important. And going back as far as the 10th of December 1940, when the common standard was achieved for peoples of all nations, the Universal Declaration is the most translated document in the world and has been available and has been translated into over 500 languages. It is as relevant today as it was the day it was adopted. The Universal Declaration states that Article 3, that everyone has the right to life, liberty, security of person. These elements build on the foundations of freedom, justice and peace around the world. All of us in society can play our part. It is important that we tackle these and we take these steps in our day-to-day lives. Each and every one of us in this chamber has an opportunity to do that. We can promote human rights. We can work with human rights. We can ensure our work, our home environments, in our education, at our schools, colleges, and even round a dinner table, that we talk about human rights. We talk about the opportunities that are there to ensure. Human rights are everyone's rights, and we have the responsibility to maintain that, to help to keep peace. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, a peaceful society is one where there is justice and equality for everyone. This is an end to what we're trying to fulfil, and the prophecy that came from the United Nations is very true. Peace will endure, a sustainable environment to take shape, and a sustainable environment will in turn help to promote peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I call Claudia Beamish to be followed by John Finney. Ms Beamish, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I wish to congratulate Bill Kidd on his motion and thank him for giving us the opportunity to debate on such an important issue as peace today in the lead up to the International Day on the 21st. I would also like to recognise the member for his tireless efforts travelling to a number of significant meetings across the globe to represent Scotland in the peace movement, and much of the other work that he does, including in the cross-party group against nuclear weapons. This year we celebrate, as we have heard, the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a milestone document in the history of human rights, which, as we've heard from Alexander Stewart earlier in his remarks, in its Article 3 states that everyone has the right to life, liberty and security, building the foundation of justice, freedom and peace amongst peoples and nations. Yet many times these fundamental principles that recognise our dignity and inalienable basic rights as human beings are being breached across the globe, not only in war-torn countries, not only in dictatorship nations, not only in developing countries, but if I may say so, here as well. We all have a right to peace. Peace in our homes, peace in our communities, and peace in our countries and between countries. Sometimes we only see peace as the mere absence of conflict and believe we have achieved it in all its forms and shapes, and forget that peace is hardly ever a permanent status of the human race, but rather a very fragile condition that we must pursue and protect at all times. We must, I suggest, all consider recommitting to working to reduce what Bill Kidd has highlighted as structural inequalities, both globally and here in Scotland. We can and must continue to be leaders on climate change, for instance, which is in my brief, and on other issues that are right across this Parliament, as well as on the global sustainable development goals. Nonetheless, even if we in our free, democratic and reasonably prosperous and reasonably equal country are striving for peace, we still face major challenges when it comes to guaranteeing our citizens' safety. And this will always be the case as long as nuclear weapons are here on our soil. While we still have weapons of mass destruction, as well as the requirement to transport them, I'm not quite sure that we can describe our nation as peaceful. I've been involved in the peace movement, not as much as others, but over a long period of time. And I strongly believe that today, more than ever, we need to bring more young people into this dialogue and ensure that they have the appropriate knowledge and adequate tools to influence change and achieve lasting results. In July, I had the honour to speak at the Peace Campaigning Academy, organised by CND Education, a 3-day-long event. And it was very important that young people were able to learn more about nuclear weapons, and equally importantly, that they found out about lobbying activities, to lobby us as their parliamentarians, communication tactics, and ways to engage in legislative processes more. It was incredible to be part of this Peace Academy, and very inspiring, along with Bill Kidd and also Ross Greer, who were there as well to share their ideas, and to hear so many people, so many young people's commitment. And my thanks also goes to Quakers in Scotland for their briefing for this debate. They too note the value of peace education for young people. Active involvement of younger generations is fundamental to ensure we create and sustain a society which is not only aware of the social issues and challenges of its communities, but has the knowledge and power to shape its future. I would like to conclude by quoting a wonderful sentence from Mr. Masashi, a survivor of the Hiroshima bombings in 1945, who said, "Humans cannot coexist with nuclear weapons. Let's work together for a world of peace." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Beamish. I call John Finney to be followed by Ruth Maguire. Mr Finney, please.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I join with others in congratulating Bill not only in bringing this debate, but thanking him for all the other work he does. And I think UN International Day of Peace has got a nice ring to it. And I only wish that some people would show the respect to the UN with regard to matters like adherence to international law. It's very reassuring to hear my colleague Claudia Beamish talk about the Peace Academy and the work that went on with Ross Greer and Bill Kidd. I think that's the future, and actually empowering young people in the way I think is to be commended. Now, the motion talks about the UN's understanding of peace as being structural rather than just an absence of violence, and that's very clearly the case. I look at some of the terminology that's used in relation to this, and I know that the UN Security Council asked the then General Secretary Boutros-Ghali in 1992 to examine ways to improve peacekeeping and peace enforcement. And I think these are key phrases. And it was in the paper Agenda for Peace that he used the phrase peace building. And peace building is post-conflict social and political reconstruction activities. Because, of course, peace is often associated with the aftermath of great terror that's visited invariably on the most vulnerable in our communities. And, of course, importantly, peace building is about preventing a repetition, and it's dialogue that's going to do that. It's not a proliferation of weapons, whatever these weapons may be. And it's distinguished from peacekeeping and peacemaking by its insistence on a society-wide reconciliation. And the role of truth and reconciliation in conflict, I think, is to be commended. And we've seen that in South Africa, we've seen it in the Balkans, and hopefully it will continue to be the case in the north of Ireland. Because it is about state building thereafter, and that is about valuing the citizen and the role that the citizen can play in prevention. Talking's never harmed anyone, and I think we can't commend that enough. Now, there's been a number of mentions made of Trident and wasted money. I think all arms money is wasted money. It's wasted energy, and I think there are opportunities for citizens to display their position on that by encouraging divestment. So, on the particulars of the motions, can I thank the International Voluntary Service for their outstanding work, and I took the opportunity to have a look at their webpage and some of their values, which I've shamelessly plagiarised now, and say that one of the first ones that's mentioned there is service, locally led action for social change. Now that's something I think everyone in this chamber would commend, talking about supporting and turning that supports behavioural change. And of course, if we're going to have sustainable peace, then we can't have anything other than every effort made to reduce violence where it exists and resolve conflict. Respect, I think, again, is key to this. And this is about respecting each other's differences, indeed valuing each other's differences. They talk about we celebrate differences in nationality, ethnicity, gender and background. I think the world's richer for all the differences we have, not weaker because of it. Integrity is something else that's in their values, and ambition. Now, we all have ambitions, and we have some very refined ambitions regarding nuances of policies here. But surely the one thing that we can all throw our weight behind is an ambition to see a world where there's collaboration and innovation, two of their other values, and most importantly, peace. So, I think it was Bill Kidd that talked about water, food and education, the UN Global Goals Agenda, and human rights. And human rights bring with them responsibilities, and we all have responsibilities. And I think there's a tendency in the so-called civilised West to think that a lot of these issues are issues for the developing world, call it what you will. The Scottish Greens have a mantra of people, planet and peace, and I think that's in common with a lot of the individual members in here. We see these as being the priorities. I'd like to thank Bill for bringing this and commend the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I gently remind members to use full names, please, in the chamber? I call Ruth Maguire to be followed by Maurice Corrie. Ms Maguire, please.
Thank you. On UN International Day of Peace 2018, we devote ourselves to strengthening ideals of peace, both within and among all nations and peoples. A peaceful society is one where there's justice and equality for everyone. Presiding Officer, I'm really grateful to my colleague Bill Kidd for securing this important debate, which means we can come together in the Chamber to observe, as many others will around the world, International Day of Peace. Bill Kidd, of course, has years and years of service to the peace movement, and I'm hugely grateful for all his hard work and commitment to the cause. The theme for 2018 is the right to peace, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 70, and celebrates the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a milestone document in the history of human rights. Drafted by representatives with different legal and cultural backgrounds from all regions of the world, the Declaration was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on the 10th of December 1948 as a common standard of achievement for all peoples, for all nations. The Universal Declaration is the most translated document in the world and is available in more than 500 languages. It is as relevant today as it was on the day it was adopted. The Universal Declaration states in Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of person. These elements build the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. Yet, the Universal Declaration does not include a separate article on the right to peace. That is why this year we're being asked to think about what the right to peace means. And those wishing to get involved in that global discussion can share their thoughts and ideas on social media using the hashtag Peace Day and hashtag Stand Up for Human Rights. Presiding Officer, when I think about peace, I think about more than the absence of violence. I think about more than the absence of war. I think about a just and equal society. A society where everyone can achieve their full potential, where no one is left behind, and where we help, nurture and protect those who need it. And of course, as well as thinking and talking, we can all act. As individuals, we can seek peaceful resolution of conflict in our everyday life when disagreements arise around us. Even in taking small steps, we can be part of the solution. Prevent an injustice in your friend group, in your school, in your college, in your workplace. It can adopt a non-violent approach to solving and reporting potential crimes, including online bullying. You can speak up when others are at risk, and you can simply stand with others. And whether you choose to do this at your dinner table, in the street, at your school, in a workplace, on the media, in a parliament, or indeed at a nuclear submarine base, it all matters and it all helps. Human rights are everyone's rights, and this International Peace Day, let's remember that we can all act and each and every one of us can stand up for rights every day.
Thank you very much. I call Maurice Corrie to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the United Nations International Day of Peace, and I thank Bill Kidd very much for bringing this members' debate today to the Chamber. This Friday, nations around the world will mark their commitment to peace on a day which has been globally shared since 1981. Peace is something that should never be taken for granted, and so having this time to recognise its significance in our everyday lives must be appreciated. It is inherently linked to our rights as citizens and as humans. Only by having these rights secured and protected can nations and individuals regain their dignity. Together, they act as a core foundation for a peaceful society wherever we are. I am sure Parliament today will join me in supporting the good work done by the United Nations. This organisation has worked long and hard to prevent the onset of wars in some of the most dangerous environments. It serves to calm disputes, restore peace if armed conflict does arise, and to promote lasting peace for those countries which have emerged from the troubles of war. I pay particular tribute to the United Nations for its tireless efforts, evident in its many peacekeeping missions throughout the years. Indeed, we can look back on its contribution to the restoration of stability in Sierra Leone, Namibia and Cambodia.
I'm sorry, I can hear you, Mr. Corrie, but I suspect not other...
I beg your pardon, sorry.
Just before, I just check, if the official report didn't hear you, I hope you'll be able to pass your material over rather than rehearse it all again.
My apologies, yeah.
Thank you.
I pay particular tribute to the United Nations for its tireless efforts, evident in its many peacekeeping missions throughout the years. Indeed, we can look back on its contribution. Yes.
John Finney.
Thank
yes, Presiding Officer.
I'm very grateful for the member taking an intervention on that point, and I fully agree with him on respect for the United Nations. Would that apply, in the member's opinion, to resolutions that are passed condemning countries or asking countries to act in line with international law, like, for instance, Israel?
Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I note the member's intervention there and thank you for it. Yes, I think it depends on the circumstances and everyone is different. There's no one common plan for each one, and I think one has to be very careful before you make a judgment in that case. Thank you. As the UN believes, these successes help to foster a culture of peace, which opens the doors for vital development goals to be reached, such as the eradication of poverty and hunger, the promotion of universal education, and the reduction in child mortality. The International Day of Peace offers us time not to just reflect on how we as nations cooperate with each other, but what more can be done to actively obtain freedom, opportunity, and protection. From my own experience in the armed forces, I've witnessed what life is like for those who do not live in countries free from war and injustice. With these military experiences, I can wholly appreciate the security we enjoy within our own borders. We're favouring deterrence by the presence of UN forces, which has been of enormous benefit in the prevention of land conflict. I believe that this is a necessity, and we should appreciate in our goal of lasting security and acceptance of every human right. This year, the theme of Peace Day is the right of peace, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 70. The Universal Declaration is a monumental document which charts the necessity of human rights and sets a shared high standard for their protection. Without our freedom of expression, our right to partake in public affairs, and our right to live in a free and just world, individuals cannot enjoy a lasting, genuine culture of peace within their nations. In the current international climate, human trafficking, intentional murder and sexual violence are still major threats to our aim for peaceful societies. Unthinkable and widespread atrocities seen in nations such as Syria and Somalia, to name but a few, lead to a mass displacement and civil unrest. For this week's International Day of Peace, the theme asks us what the right of peace means to us. Surely it means that further international cooperation and support of the United Nations is needed to deal with the challenges these nations face. There are a wealth of ways that we can participate in Peace Day this Friday, whether it be through our schools, sports, the arts, or the environment. I am pleased to see that this International Day of Peace will be highlighted in events across Scotland. Indeed, the University of Dundee is offering a talk on democracy and security of Gambia, which is now entering a new political era and seeks to strengthen its links with other international partners. Allenton Peace Sanctuary in Lanarkshire gives the opportunity to plant peace poles, which are universally recognised as a symbol for peace. It is estimated over 200,000 peace poles have now been planted across the world since this project first began in Japan in 1976. In Glasgow, the public are invited to participate in 1 minute silence, followed by meditation and to both acknowledge and celebrate the Peace Day. And in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, I hope that this year's International Day of Peace, we recognise what has been done and what can still be done to further cooperation both within and among nations in our world today. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I call Rona Mackay, can I say I have two members still wishing to speak in this debate, so I'm therefore minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 8.14.3 to extend the debate by up to 30 minutes. And I now invite Bill Kidd to move a motion without notice.
Move the motion. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
The question is that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes. Are we all agreed? That's agreed, so I now call Rona Mackay to be followed by Tom Arthur, who will be the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Mackay, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I too thank Bill Kidd for bringing this debate to the Chamber and for his long-standing commitment to peace and ridding the world of nuclear weapons. The theme of this year's International Day of Peace, as we've heard, is the right to peace, which celebrates the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights, and it's entirely fitting, because everyone has a right to peace. It's a fundamental human right. Sadly, however, we know that this right has been eroded throughout the world as we witness horrific scenes of needless violence and wars taking place in far too many places throughout the world. The heartbreaking scenes we see daily on the news of children suffering as collateral damage, or in some cases being specifically targeted, actually defy belief. How can humanity become so badly eroded in a person or collectively in a regime that this is thought to be acceptable? So the world looks on helplessly as children suffer in Syria and the Yemen and in places which have yet to make headlines. How many more must die or be maimed before the regimes that are responsible stop the killing? The Quakers Society briefing, for which I thank them, states their belief that Scotland can be a country that leads others in peace, but that peace, far from being passive, is an active thing that has to be pursued, encouraged and performed on a continual basis to exist. There is a difference between merely keeping the peace and actively encouraging conflict resolution. They rightly say that when the world appears to be so divided, becoming less tolerant and compassionate, that Scotland should make a commitment to learning about and modelling peace as a first step to becoming world leaders in this area. Presiding Officer, there's nothing I would want more, and I suspect everyone in this chamber. But until the Westminster Government stops sending arms to regimes who use them to maim children and cause horrific widespread suffering, the killing will go on. Our nation, the nation of Scotland, cannot become peacekeepers or actively encourage conflict resolution until we have control over our own independent defence industry. I say to the Westminster Government, do not send arms to countries who kill children in my name, in my family's name or in Scotland's name. Presiding Officer, my 98-year-old father-in-law, who's now sadly in his last month, fled for his life in a coal ship from Dunkirk. Like all veterans, he lost best friends and saw things a 17-year-old should never have to see or do. Until recently, he said very little about his traumatic experience during the Second World War. But the family now knows that he believes wars do not solve anything and that peaceful resolution must be sought at all costs. I agree with him, despite the achievements and sacrifices so many made in that war, which did have a legitimate aim. Presiding Officer, we can never stop countries breaking into civil war or committing violence in its people. But I say again, we must not be enablers and we must not use force in a quest for peace. We know from experience in Iraq and Afghanistan that this doesn't work. We should not forget either that war has not broken out between European countries while they've been a member of the European Union. But then that's another debate entirely. And of course, peace is not just about stopping wars. It's about how we live our lives in common humanity, as Bill Kidd outlined and many others have said. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, has asked us all to speak up for gender equality and promote inclusive societies, do our part at school, at work, at home, talking to friends and family, and stand up for human rights and call out those who abuse them. Every step counts. Let's all act to promote and defend human rights for all in the name of lasting peace for us and for future generations.
Thank you very much. I call Tom Arthur.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate, and I would like to begin by thanking my colleague Bill Kidd for securing this debate. I must confess that I had not intended to speak, but Bill Kidd's speech was so powerful and compelling and moving that I felt moved to respond and share some of my thoughts. And before doing so, I would like to welcome Ben McPherson to his new role. I know Ben is a champion and campaigner for peace both at home and internationally, and I have every confidence that he's going to excel in his new position. I'm very much looking forward to his response to this debate. Presiding Officer, 2 days ago I had the great pleasure of attending a service in Paisley Abbey, which was to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Royal Air Force, and also, in doing so, to remember the sacrifice of airmen over the past century, and particularly airmen and airwomen, and particularly in the Battle of Britain. And as I was listening to the various remarks and contributions that have been made throughout this debate, I was reflecting back to that service and two of the key lessons that we learned from those two global catastrophes of the First and Second World War, and in particular their origins and what they tell us about peace and how fragile peace is. It's well known to any high-school student of history that World War I perhaps could be characterised as having happened by accident, misunderstanding, misreading, and people being compelled into taking action. Clearly there were events that led up to it, but it was a conflict that no one wanted, no one needed, and until very shortly before it occurred, not many people saw coming. And that speaks to the importance for communication, for understanding, for giving the benefit of the doubt, for a willingness to be able to empathise and understand other people's positions and situations, and to take opportunities to steer off catastrophe long before it happens. The lessons from World War II are somewhat different in how war came about. The gradual erosion of what is fundamental to peace, and that is civic society. It is an independent judiciary. It's free and open and transparent elections and a strong democracy. It's a free press, the ability to criticise. But fundamentally, what is required in such societies is a willingness to be able to engage and communicate with each other. A common set of understandings of what counts as truth and fact, and the lessons of the decay of Weimar into what emerged in Germany in the 1930s and the consequent conflagration that engulfed Europe are lessons that are as valuable as ever. We are in a society where, in a global society, particularly in the West, where we have the rise of fake news, a tribal and entrenched politics where two sides can't speak to each other, sides looking for the easy goal, easy media hit, rather than necessarily searching for the truth, seeking to simplify rather than admit complexity. And that is a danger because it can result in the breakdown of civil society. And the common thread through all of this debate has been that peace is not something that is natural or exists. It is something that is hard-won. It is something that must be built and rebuilt constantly. It is such a fragile entity, and I think as we mark UN International Day of Peace 2018, as we look across the world and we look at our democratic and civic institutions that are under threat from extremes on both sides of the political spectrum, it is absolutely imperative that we recommit ourselves to building peace, not just in the global sense, but at home and in how we conduct ourselves in our daily lives and our attitudes towards each other. And I hope that is a message that will resonate from this chamber today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on Ben McPherson to close with the Government Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it's a real privilege to speak in conclusion of this really illuminative and important debate that we've had here this evening. As others have, first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Bill Kidd for bringing this motion to debate today. It's such an important motion for all of us to think about, not just the Day of Peace itself, but the wider points around it, as has been described and commented upon by several members. This motion and subject and area is of interest to me, not just in my capacity as Minister, but also one that is close to me on a personal level. And at this point, I declare an interest that as a idealistic but determined 20-year-old and disheartened by the Iraq War in 2003, but determined to do something in the cause of peace, walked from Edinburgh to London to raise awareness of Peace Day in that year, and then worked for Peace One Day that Bill Kidd mentioned the year after in 2005. And I did that then because I believed, as I believe now, that a more peaceful world is possible. And by spreading awareness through debates like we're having this evening and all of the activism that has been described across the chamber, we can promote a more peaceful world. And Peace Day gives us the chance to reflect and act on that sense of common purpose. As the former Secretary-General of the United Nations, who sadly passed away this summer, Kofi Annan, said in support of Peace Day, any moment, whether it's a day or a week, when we can get the competence to pause, to think, and reflect on what they are doing to their own people and to the environment, will be a great achievement. And I would support it 100%. And as was referenced by Bill Kidd, that sense of reflection can also have really significant practical implications, whether it's the International Voluntary Service raising awareness here in Scotland, as I did on my walk to London and others have done in their activism, creating peace in our communities, or whether it's what Bill Kidd described, the real practical life-saving implications of Peace Day. For example, in 2007, when the World Health Organization, UNICEF and the Afghan Ministry of Health immunised 1.4 million children in 2007 against polio, and then 1.6 million in 2008 against polio. This shows that these concepts of peace can have a real impact in terms of lives saved and communities protected. It is clear from the debate that we've had this evening as well that Scotland has a role to play as a nation which does its bit to promote peace overseas. A nation that endeavours to be a good global citizen, and a nation whose domestic policies reflect the fair and sustainable approach we aim to achieve in our international engagement. And of course, one of the key contributions that Scotland can make towards promoting peace is our commitment to all of the UN goals, not just Goal 16, but all of them, as part of the structural peace building that others have mentioned. The global goals provide an integrated framework to achieving a better and more sustainable future for all, addressing common challenges relating to poverty, inequality, climate, peace and justice. And in the Scottish Government, we have made a dual commitment to the global goals, domestically for Scotland and in contributing internationally through our international development work. Our international development strategy outlines the approach we will be taking between now and 2030 to help reduce global poverty and promote sustainable development and human rights. And partnership and collaboration will continue to be the foundation for our future development work as we build on our existing bilateral partnerships with Malawi, Zambia, Rwanda and Pakistan, working across borders to address the shared challenges our world faces in pursuit of these goals. And of course, we also have our Humanitarian Emergency Fund as well for moments of crisis. And we are conscious that in order to act with credibility in other places, we must also work to protect and promote human rights and address poverty and inequalities here in Scotland. And that is why our domestic policy has at its heart sustainable inclusive economic growth and our commitment to a fairer Scotland. And just as we are committed to achieving greater social justice, we are also committed to protecting human rights. The UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted 70 years ago. And in Scotland, we are committed to giving further and better effect to international human rights standards encapsulated in the Declaration. This commitment of making rights real in people's everyday lives is reflected in the new National Performance Framework, which has an explicit human rights indicator, and our commitment to human rights is also demonstrated by the Scottish Government's work to fulfil our obligations across the 7 core UN human treaties to which the UK is a party. That includes measures to tackle poverty and promote fair work, to eliminate racial discrimination, to promote gender equality and disable people's rights, and to use the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as a framework to ensure that children's rights are embedded in all decision-making. And of course, that is particularly important in this year of young people. As the Programme for Government demonstrates, equality is firmly embedded throughout all of the government's activities. That starts at the heart of government, where we have one of the few gender-based cabinets in the world. And this all matters when it comes to aspiring to the ideal of Peace Day, because creating the structural conditions others have mentioned to support international peace at a domestic level provides support to global societies managing inequalities and conflict as well. We have embedded a refreshed international framework, a focus on tackling inequality, and this means that all of our international engagement is guided by our commitment to the universally recognised values enshrined in human rights treaties. And this includes, of course, what we provide to refugees, asylum seekers and our local communities through the pioneering and collaborative approach of our new Scots Refugee Assistance Strategy. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, so much could be said about Peace Day and Scotland's role in it. Scotland has a unique contribution to offer the world through our people's expertise on education, health improvement, climate change, renewable energy, human rights and research, along with our innovative partnership approach to international development. And we will be continuing to evolve that through our international development work. We are already making a significant contribution, sharing particular knowledge, skills and technical expertise globally, and we will continue to do so. By taking a fair, sustainable and inclusive approach, we demonstrate that we are a country that promotes human rights, democratic values and supports the structures and global efforts involved in promoting international peace. In this time of flux and challenge, Peace Day on Friday and in the years ahead is a chance to promote ceasefire and non-violence, not just for 24 hours, but in the wider context of social justice, the global goals and sustainable development. And in that spirit, and in the words of Kofi Annan that I referenced earlier, I support it 100% and encourage all to mark Peace Day this Friday in what they do, whether that's in social media, their communities or their everyday lives.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate and I close this meeting.